The live stream will be starting in 5 minutes. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Chibi Akima's show will be starting very soon. Thank you for watching. Don't change that channel. And good morning, good evening, or good afternoon. And welcome to Joan from Spain. Thanks for you dropping in. And today we're going to be having a look at the Famicom, sorry, not the Super Famicom, the regular Famicom. Now, I grew up with the NES, of course, which is the English rebranding of the Famicom, essentially. I know there's some technical differences, but not too much. So today I thought it'd be fun to play with some Famicom games. So we're going to be playing with this today and we're going to be trying it out. Now, please let me know if the audio settings are not to your liking. I am listening to my own stream here just to try and keep an eye on things, but it's going to be a bit tricky because I'm going to be playing games and things at the same time. So let me know how things work out. Now, one thing you may not know about YouTube is that you might often see streamers and they're playing a game on a system like this, and you'll always be thinking, turn the damn volume up on the game, and a lot of the time they're actually doing it because they get copyright struck on the game music and things. So that's something you might not know that might explain why so many YouTubers seem completely unable to control the sound of their games. But I'm not particularly worried about that because with 64 subscribers and no monetization on the channel, don't really care about either. And the whole point of having the second channel was so that I could not worry about if it got stuck or even if it got deleted. Well, if that happens, then I'll stop doing it. Anyway, so as I say, we've got our Famicom here. Now, this is one of my Famicoms. I own four, I think. One I managed to break, trying to put an analog conversion on. I've got the conversion on this one. Normally they only have TV out, but you can modify them relatively easy with just a capacitor and a transistor, I think. So this one's been modified by me. Another one was modified before I bought it. And then I've got my nice looking one, which I use for model shots. So when you see the shots on my website and things, that's the very nice looking one. This is the very not nice looking one because the front's missing and it's dirty and horrible. Would you believe the horrifying state of this thing is after it's been cleaned? You know, it works very nicely, but it looks pretty bad. Now, the main reason I use this one as my main machine these days is, well, if you see the game I'm running the Greeky, I forget what it's called now, Kira Star DX. Now, there's been a few of these games released recently that are sort of modern games. The thing with them is they don't have the copy protection chips in them, quite understandably, because of Japanese law with regards to copy protection circumvention. It's illegal, so you can't get mod chips even for ancient consoles and things. So this game won't work on almost all Famicoms, but I guess this Famicom's so old it doesn't have the copy protection chip in it because it works fine, and everything does work fine on it. So for that reason I use this as my main one, even though it looks blooming ugly, and it's what we're going to be using today. Now, I've obviously upgraded my hardware today. We've got a new camera here, hello there, and we're using an analog capture device. It's a IO data analog capture device. It cost about $40. That does mean we've got some analog distortion here because there are some upgrades you can do to remove the analog distortion, but I can't really be bothered with that. And to be honest, if I was going to make it look like a HDMI signal, I might as well just run an emulator. So we're going to have a bit of a more rough and rugged feel today, but that's kind of what I want to see with these old consoles. I do have a HDMI capture device as well, and I could chain that to an analog capture device or something, but I thought it was going to be easier this way, at least for an early stream while I'm still getting used to things. And we'll see how things go forwards, whether it's this is the way I decide to do things going onwards. The other thing is just let me know if the video is having problems for you, if it's really blurry, blocky, compressed, because contrary to everyone's belief that Japan has like flying robots and all this kind of thing, it's not entirely true. My internet speed seems to be around 1000 kilobit here. My stream, if it goes up to 2000 kilobits, it will start dropping frames. So I've had to cap it at like 1024. I'm still streaming at full HD, and maybe that's a mistake. So just let me know what you think of the video signal if you're not happy with it, and I will maybe set it to just 720p instead of something next time. But I'm hoping I can keep from having to change the settings every time depending on what kind of stream I'm doing, because you can guarantee if we do that I'll forget. Anyway, so this is the machine we're going to be working with today, and let's have a look at the games I've selected for a tryout today. So the first three games I'm going to be playing today are the ones that I had when I was a kid. Now, I got the Nintendo NES very late on in its life. I got it Christmas, and I think I got it about 7.5 seconds before the Super Nintendo was released. I think literally the first magazine I bought, like the Nintendo magazine, it announced the rotten Super Famicom. So I never really got that many games of it, and plus the fact they were absurdly expensive, as I'm sure you all know. So the games I had were the game that came with it, which was Super Mario Brothers. I'd say obviously completely different size to this, but I had that game. I had the Ninja Turtles game, and I had Mario 3. Now, beyond that, you couldn't see that there, could you? Now, beyond that, we're going to play 2 of the games probably, just depending on how long I play those for. We're going to play Neketsu Soccer. Now, a friend of mine had the English version of that. It was called Nintendo World Cup, which is absolutely hilarious because Neketsu Soccer isn't very realistic if you've ever played it. It's incredibly violent. You can like knock your opponent's players unconscious and keep playing the game. So the fact that they just shoved a regular soccer guy in the front and made it look like every other soccer game in existence is just comical to me. But it's a fun game. And we may play some Gun Knack because why not? I was testing the rig out with Gun Knack, and it's been a long time since I played it, and I seem to remember it being quite a fun, quirky little vertical shooter. Now, one very, very strong disclaimer I have to give you. I've not played this thing for years, so not played any of these games for years, really. I'm probably going to suck extremely badly, so if you're watching this to see some amazing gameplay, give up now and go and watch someone else. What I am going to do, though, is I'm going to be talking the whole time. I'll be answering any comments in the chat, and I'll be trying to give sort of technical narration on the system and what have you. So if you want to make fun of my gameplay, you're totally welcome to. Knock yourself out, whatever you want to do. But I'm hoping I can maybe just give a bit more of background behind the system itself, the hardware, and my memories of it. Because if you're, I don't know how old my audience is, but if you're sort of 20 or 18 or less, then you won't know this system. You won't know how it sort of compared at the time to the other machines people were using and what people's thoughts were of it. So I want to sort of just tell you what the machine means to me in comparison to the other machines around, because I had other machines and I knew people with other machines. So maybe that will be more interesting, because as I say, the gameplay, if you're looking for a perfect playthrough, give up now. You're not going to see it. Oh, sorry, I just turn the volume down on one of my phones here because it's making silly noises on the mic. There we go. Okay, so we're not going to play the Riki Kira Kira Star game because it's okay, but it's very repetitive, and as I say, I'm more interested in playing the retro stuff today, so that's what we're going to be doing. So we'll just turn that off now. Now, if you're watching the video and commenting on it, just bear in mind there is an approximately 20 to 30 second delay between something happening on screen and before you actually see it. So if you comment on something, don't be surprised if it takes a long time for me to reply, or what you suggest I do I can't do because the moment has passed. So just bear that in mind. Also bear in mind that the Famicom cables are extremely short, so I'll probably be getting too excited and yanking the Famicom off the desk at some point, and the stream might become abruptly short at that point. But anyway, we'll try and work within these limitations that we've got. So here's the Super Mario Brothers game, of course, very classic game. I'll just turn the audio on. We do have some analog noise, quite serious analog noise on this, but hopefully it won't be too bad. I have got the volume relatively low to try and compensate for that, but quite interestingly, it does actually get better if I unplug the laptop, because I'm streaming from a laptop today. I'm also actually playing while watching on the laptop monitor itself, so seeing the video stream as I'm playing. Now, the only problem with this is the frame rate is unfortunately quite bad. I think I'm pushing the laptop a bit hard because I've got it plugged into my 4K monitor now, and I think that's putting its tiny Intel graphics card to shame a little bit. But may have to kind of resize the view window just to try and ease up the load. As I say, this is still very much a test to see what the best configuration for everything is. I may decide that this isn't working and I'll use some kind of splitter, and that way I'll be able to play on a machine that isn't being slowed down. But I figured this in a lot of ways would be better because I can see what you're seeing. So if there's problems like the stream's cut out, then that won't be a problem, and also I can keep a better eye on the chat if it's all on the same screen. So as I say, we are testing things out, and as I say, if you're watching this to see someone play Super Mario, then this isn't the one. Now I'll show you an interesting thing here. You see the clouds in the sky and the those kind of bushes at the bottom, the green bushes. They're the same tiles. they've reused the tiles for the clouds and the bushes. Now, I never noticed that as a kid, you know. I only saw that on Twitter, and you suddenly realise, yeah, that's definitely true. Quite an impressive bit of reuse there. Now, the other thing, of course, is this was a very early game on the Famicom, the Nintendo. Well, that's not true, sorry. It was a relatively early game. The very early games tended to be a bit more Atari, very crude, very simple graphics and gameplay. This one was really a level up from that, where it started to, you know, feel more like an arcade game and really started to give the competition a challenge technically. But it's still a relatively basic game. There's no crazy you know, pushing of the limitations of the system, so to speak. But as I say, it was certainly impressive for me. Now, when I bought this, I think at the time I had that was stupid, and the interlacing has made me invisible. That's brilliant. I'm running this at 30 frames a second, and because it flickers when you get hit, I was invisible and couldn't see myself. So that might be a reason why I should maybe be using the splitter, as I said. Anyway, compared to the other systems around, I had the Amstrad CPC at the time. I was still using that, and I think I had an old PCXT, and my dad had a 386. So those were the kind of machines that you know, I was exposed to at that time. And I mean, you may or may not be familiar with those kind of caliber of machines, but this was graphically mostly superior to the CPC, although the CPC 16 color mode did look a lot more colorful in some cases. But the thing was the frame rate. You know, this was so smooth, and of course that's because of the hardware sprites. So you know, even Super Mario 1, which wasn't really, you know, the NES did a lot more later on, and we'll see that with Super Mario 3 and the Ninja Turtles game. But even this relatively early game, compared to what the NES did later on, the smoothness of the gameplay was absolutely amazing. Now, if you look at the layout of the game, you may know a bit about the NES hardware, but essentially it works as a tile sprite system. So it's capable of a small number of sprites. I can't remember off the top of my head, and I'm not going to look it up just this moment, but it's about 40 sprites on the screen, something of that kind of nature. And they're only 8x8 and only 4 colours, 3 colours if you count one as transparent. So everything else has to be done with the tiles. Now, the tiles can cover the entire screen, but every square of the screen can't be different, at least not on this version. It's got very little memory, the basic NES, and they kept upgrading it. They kept adding internal upgrades to the hardware, and I just died. I just went for a fire flower that I didn't need, and then I jumped off the platform. Very stupid. So the NES had to do a lot of stuff with its tile map to make the games make them look detailed, because, as I say, it just didn't have the sprite capabilities for that. And a level like this, I mean, I'm sure you can guess, but effectively a lot of the tiles are the same as the previous level, and they've just changed the palette. So the palette was orange in this one, and now it's blue. That's a trick they used to do a lot to change the appearance of the graphics, and that's how, as I said before, they do that cloud and that grass using the same. That was bloody stupid. To use the same graphics for the clouds and for the bushes there, but yeah, this was all the kind of thing they had to do when, you know, cartridge ROM was still expensive, and of course the you know, the memory of the video memory was limited. Now, by default, the NES can't change any of its tile definitions. I don't think the basic NES couldn't do. Now, they started adding upgrades, and in my tutorial series, I basically cheated a bit, and I put an upgrade in the cartridge, missed that, and that allowed me to define my own tiles in RAM, but by default you couldn't. They had to be in ROM, so that even removed the ability to sort of dynamically change tiles on the go. Now, you'll see things like that question mark block up there are flashing. That's of course done with the tiles, and they're just changing the palette there for some animation, because, as I say, there's not enough sprites to do, you know, these kind of dense, large amounts of objects that are changing all the time. So, you know, the Mario character will be made up of sprites, He looks like 3 colours, so he'll be made up of a couple of sprites there. And then the Goombas, of course, will be sprites, but all of the background will basically be tiles. Because that's, as I say, that's really what you have to do. And the NES can't do more than 1 layer, so there's no chance of parallax or anything like that. So whenever we hit a block there, I'm pretty sure it's going to change to a sprites for the animation, because the tiles have to be on an 8x8 grid. So, you know, if you need to do more smooth movement like the Goombas or the player, or, as I say, the blocks bouncing up in the air, then you're really going to be going into the territory of the sprites to do that. See if we can get the file. So, let's see if we can do a bit better at World War II this time. I just noticed you can't really hear the music of the game here. Just turned it up a bit. It's now far too loud for me, but maybe it's a bit more bit better for you. So anyway, sorry, I'm just listening for the music to change, because I'm trying to get the volume just right, but it's quite loud on the... I'm wearing 2 pairs of headphones, listening one to the actual computer and one to the stream on my mobile phone, just to check the audio, but the way it's appearing to me was very loud, but the way it was appearing on the live stream was very, very quiet, so I've just pausing a moment to just double check that. So anyway, so you see these runs of coins here. Now, of course, these can't really be done with the sprites because of the sprite limitations of the hardware. So again, that's going to be a time where they're going to use the tile map to do that job for it. Because, as I say, they're always going to be having to basically, you know, be sparing with the sprites, because the sprites, I think there's around 40 on the screen. But even beyond that, there's a limit to how many can be on the same line, because the hardware is not just limited to the number on the screen, it's limited to the number on the line. There we go. Sounds okay from here. Thanks for letting me know, James. That's kind of... I have just turned it up a little bit. As I say, it's actually now too loud for me on the earphones, unfortunately. I need some headphones with an inline volume control or something, maybe. Let me just... Actually, maybe I can change my... Right. I've just changed this. It's very confusing. I've got 4 volume controls on my interface here. You know, one for my microphone, one for my desktop audio, one for my capture device, and one for the webcam. It's getting a bit crazy, and I think I can turn down the desktop audio without it making any effect to your live stream. So it's getting very confusing. As I say, this is all me still, in some ways, getting used to the live streaming software and just trying to work out how I want to do things. I'm just getting a feeling for what works, you know, sort of. It's there's a bit of a sort of compromise, you know. You want to sort of do the stream in a certain way and make it fun and joking, but then, you know, when the record button goes, your sort of confidence goes a little bit, and you sort of clam up a little bit maybe, and it becomes there's a sort of trade-off between, you know, how would you like to act and how do you end up acting, and then, you know, how should you act. So it's not just a hardware problem, is what I'm saying. There's also the, you know, there's the pressure, and there's the, you know, planning for what you're going to say, and, you know, getting documents ready if you want to discuss documents and things. So as I say, it's all early days yet, and I'm just trying to get the hang of it. So I got 6, it says there's 6 people watching at the moment, but I think it's probably 5 or 4, because one of them is certainly me on the phone, and it might also count the previous stream on my desktop. But I'm kind of glad I'm only got 1 or 2 at the moment, because it takes the pressure off a little bit in case I do mess up the volume, or, you know, knock the camera on the floor or something embarrassing. So as I say, it is still early days, and I'm just getting used to everything. And also getting used to playing the game again, because as I say, I did play this a few years ago, and I could get a few levels in, but I am having some slight problems with the graphics. But I'm not going to have the NEC PC 8001 version. I lose track, end of the line, Joel. I mean, there was that. I seem to remember downloading a Super Mario Brothers version on something, but it's always difficult to tell what's even official, because a lot of the fan developers make their own fake versions, and some of these are as old as the when the back in the day kind of thing. So it's not just the stuff that came out in the last 6 months that's around there. There is actually very old stuff that's fake. Especially in Japan, they have these sort of fan games that are quite popular. So I've seen fan games on the X68000 of cartoon series that were out in the 90s, and they were released back in the day. So I have seen, I can't remember if it was the 9801, but I have seen a sort of fairly convincing Mario clone. But I'll have another look at that, and if it's yeah, I understood it was an official version. I'm just saying I've definitely seen some weird old clone of Mario. I just can't remember whether it was the official one or if it was on a completely different system. I don't have a 8801. I have been looking at it sort of haphazardly as a future tutorial destination, but what I'll do is I'll have a look at it and I'll see if it looks worthy of some live streaming, and if it is, then we'll have a go at it. But yeah. I can't quite imagine Mario with flick screen scrolling. It sounds a bit defeating the point, because as I say, it was the fact that the scrolling was so smooth that made it so remarkable to all of the people with Amstrad CPCs and XT PCs and things. So yeah, but it's not the weirdest thing they did. I don't know if you remember that Game Boy version, the Game Boy Color version of this, and they cloned the game, but the screen was smaller, so it scrolled left and right, but only within the artificial limitations of the NES, so you could only scroll left a little bit, and then it still wouldn't let you scroll again. It's very weird, but it was a nice port of the game. I bought it at the time, and I was quite enthralled with it for a while, but never got as good at it as I did when I had this as a kid, because I didn't have many games for the a nasty clone on the STU. Yeah. But as I say, that short-lived C64 version. I mean, that was a work of genius. I mean, this Commodore 64's got a 1 megahertz processor. How they managed to emulate anything the NES could do in that kind of processing power is just beyond me. Because the processor, the NES isn't technically a 6502, but it almost is. I mean, really, the only difference is it's got some of that extra hardware built into it for the other NES functions, and it's missing the binary coded decimal functionality, which is just weird, but it is. And but that's just so trivial. You're like, why did they take that out? Maybe it was like chip space for making the silicon, but I was able to emulate the missing function for Grimes 6502 with about 4 lines of code, so it was really, really trivial. But as I say, the thing is, when you think about trying to emulate this system, I think the NES has got about a 1 megahertz processor, so it's not like it's not like the C64's got 4 times the CPU power or anything to be emulating other systems, emulating all the graphics hardware and software. So very impressive job there. But of course, Nintendo thought otherwise. The homebrew version of Super Mario, yes, it was excellent. Well, yeah, I mean, the fact that they were able to make it run at all, and I mean, one thing that I suspect is, I would guess that maybe I'm wrong, but my initial thought was they've probably written some kind of emulation, not quite emulator, but simulator for the NES hardware, and so maybe they could, just start mass porting Nintendo games with relatively little work. But I thought maybe that was why Nintendo were especially jumpy, because they're probably thinking, hey, we want to sell these on mobile phones in the future. These games, I mean. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. End of the line, Joe. Well, yeah, I mean, I think they could cut a little bit more slack and just turn a blind eye. They can't approve of these things because, it'll be open season, but, just say nothing, do nothing, and, wag a finger and leave it at that. But, it's difficult because for a while I was kind of boycotting Nintendo on the basis of where they're treating the fans like crap, especially when they started taking all the money from the live streamers. It was like, this is just not proportionate. And so I was kind of boycotting them back then. But to be honest, if you start boycotting the companies that do bad things now, you just won't play any games again. So, what do you do? So, anyway. Sorry, I'm getting behind on the chat. Let me pause the game and read the chat. This kind of game used to be hard to implement. Well, good point on the C64 version on the NES. I mean, I've only very quickly played the C64 version, and it was like, well, this is a masterpiece of programming. I didn't play it long enough to comment if it was a replacement for the NES version. But the only thing I would say is when I got my NES, I think it was about £120 or something like that, which is relatively cheap, and it came with Mario 3. So obviously you didn't pay £120 for Mario. You bought it for the console itself, so maybe they would have survived. I mean, if they'd have ported something like Mario 3, for example, that was only sold in its own right, so that would have been very embarrassing for Nintendo. But I say, from a programming point of view, incredible piece of work. It's the kind of thing that you would, if someone said, "Oh, I'm going to port, Super Mario to the C64," then all of the people who think they know stuff would have shouted, "Oh, that's impossible, you're a fool for trying," that kind of thing. And obviously they were wrong in that case. But that's just, you do see people say that quite a lot on the forums, the programming forums, the people who think they know better than everyone. And I understand where they're coming from, because you don't want people to waste their time, and there's always the suspicion that people who make those kind of claims are just spouting nonsense. But I think you need to keep an open mind, because I say, when you look at things like what the Batman group have done and things, it's like there are people who pull miracles out. They do it occasionally, and you don't want to be dispelling people just because what they're saying sounds crazy, because maybe they can pull it off. And even if they can't, honestly, you don't want to just wash away people's optimism and hopes and things. The Gianna sisters, I've only vaguely seen it. I would have to say the graphics kind of put me off, because it didn't look as good as Mario, even in stills. And by then I'd never even heard of it back in the sort of 90s. So I'd already got the Mario games by the time it was probably even out, or probably even banned would be more accurate. But yeah. I agree. The C64 version, as I say, it seems so accurate compared to it apparently even had the same bugs and the same glitches. So as I say, I can only assume it was a simulator of the NES, and that to some extent, or a recompile, so that most of the code, not just the graphics, was actually in some way converted for the C64, but done in such a way that the C64 was fast enough to do it. But as I say, you're correct, it was incredible. Yeah, anyway, so we're going to move on to Super Mario 3. Now, a friend of mine had Super Mario 2, and we will have a look at that another time. But I've actually got Super Mario 2 USA, which is what everyone in the UK knows as Super Mario 2, or the US even. They released it in Japan as well on a cartridge. But I also have the Doki Doki Panic, the heart-pounding panic game, which was converted into Super Mario for the Famicom disk system. So I want to check my Famicom disk still works, and then assuming it does, I want to do a kind of comparison stream where we're going to play both versions. So we're not going to play Mario 2 today, but we will get to it at some point. Now, Mario 3 for me was really where 2 years. I'd forgotten. I mean, they could get away with that kind of thing back then because there was no internet or anything. So, you know, no one really knew. I didn't know anyway. I heard it was coming out, and I used to watch that Super Mario show, which they used to sort of put on Sky or something at the time. And, you know, that we all knew about that. But, that, you know, apart from that kind of thing, we weren't going to find out how we were being scammed. But the best one for me for the massive delays in games was the Pokemon game. I heard about the Pokemon game when I went to university, and I'll be honest, I got it on an emulator, as most people did that kind of thing back then, and I played it. It was quite fun. I quite liked it. And then I was visiting my parents, going back on the train, and I popped into a game store to see if there was anything to buy because I'd just bought a Game Boy Color, and they got a stack of the Pokemon games, and no one was buying them because no one knew what it was. They'd imported them from the US, but the cartoon hadn't come out yet, and so no one had a clue what it was. So it was just sitting there unsold. So I grabbed a copy and I played it all the way home. Then of course the cartoon came out and it became massively popular, and then they actually released the Raccoon Tail on the 3. Yeah, that's right. It's cute, isn't it? I didn't notice it at first, but yeah, it's quite funny. Still not quite sure why the raccoon flies. The suit with the tail that turns into a stone statue is a Japanese thing. The Tanuki raccoon dog, it's believed to play tricks on people in Japan and fake dead. I mean, I think the animal kind of plays dead, and so it's believed to be a trickster. And so that's why it turns into a stone statue and avoids being hurt by the enemies. But I don't know why the leaf turns you into a flying raccoon. Maybe it's a Japanese fable, but it's not one I've heard of. But, sorry, where was I? Oh yeah, the Pokemon game. So the cartoon then came out, and the game became popular, and when it was finally released, you couldn't buy it anywhere, but I already owned it 2 years earlier, and the shelves were full of copies, and no one wanted them because no one knew what it was. But I think the reason the Pokemon game was heavily delayed being released in the UK was just a couple of years before, when I was at college, which is 16 to 18. We all heard this big rumour of this TV series making Japanese kids have epileptic fits and vomit blood and things. That was what was being said anyway. I don't think that's probably likely, but that's what was being said. And we didn't know at the time, but of course that was the Pokemon episode Porygon, the Virtual Warrior thing, which caused the epileptic fits because they did a 60 hertz flashing light, which you're not supposed to do. So yes, Super Mario definitely had extra hardware in its cart. I've got a list of all of the upgrades. I mean, this is something I really miss about these old systems. You know, back in these days, they upgraded them over and over again, crazy upgrades, and that's why the games got better and better, and not just from a gameplay point of view, from a technical ability point of view. It was so impressive to see the evolutions that clever scientists were able to slap in there and make. You know, I say the early generation of the NES was basically just an old Atari game, you know, with your original Mario boss with two guys chucking turtles on a single non-scrolling screen, and over the years it just got better and better and better. And as you say, Super Mario 3 really was it was the swan song of the system. Well, Turtles also, but this was really, you know, I personally wasn't a fan of Super Mario All-Stars. I owned it, but I wasn't a fan of it because it just felt cheap. Well, it was cheap. It was very good value for money, and if you didn't own a NES, I guess it would have been okay. But they took what was an absolute pinnacle of 8-bit gaming, and they just turned it into a cheap, we kind of slapped some better colour graphics on, and it's the same game, and there's no improvements. And it was just like, well, when I played this on the NES, this had some character. This had some real, you know, 8-bit feelings to it, and it felt. Oh no, I've got some real trouble here. What am I doing? Talking too much and not playing very well, I think, is the problem. I'm going to pause and read the chat. Just notice something that. Is it the sample drums? Is it the Japanese version? No, I don't think so. That's one of the upgrades that my understanding was added to the Mario games, the Mario 3 game. I can't confirm that off the top of my head, but I remember hearing that was an upgrade, a hardware upgrade in the cartridge. The Famicom does have, I think it's FM sound, that the NES doesn't have, and some of the games, I think this is one of the things people hack out, that some of the games for the UK NES have the FM sound that they can't play, and you can upgrade a NES with the FM sound, to my memory anyway. Mario 3 is harder than in its Japanese release. Yes, they did. If you've got the tail or the fire flower on the Japanese version and you die, you go back to Little Mario, whereas in the UK version you go back to Big Mario. So yes, they obviously thought the stupid foreigners couldn't cope with it and they'd better make it a bit easier for them. But yeah, I say I this paused in totally the wrong moment. If you ask me, is Super Mario World better than Super Mario 3, then I'd probably say yes it is. But considering the technical limitations of the NES compared to the in comparison the relative no limitations of the SNES, this was a real pinnacle of achievement. They really did something technically remarkable to release a game of this standard on a system as old and as limited and at the absolute end of its life. Because this came out after in the UK, I think this came out after I'd heard that the NES was now obsolete and the SNES was on the way. So as I say, it was a real, it was a real swan song for the system, and it's one that if I actually put more time into playing and actually got good again, it would be one that be perfectly willing to play today and not. The Sega Master System. Is it the Sega Master System I'm thinking of then? I do have the power base for the. Oh, hang on a minute, I'm getting confused. I thought the power base was the upgrade for the Genesis that allowed you to play Master System games. I've got the Mark III, which is the Japanese Master System, and I've got a Western Master System as well. But yeah, the Famicom was a brilliant design. It's certainly won. It's like the Super Nintendo. I'd sort of say the Super Nintendo, the Genesis. If I'm going to program, I prefer the Genesis, but the Super Nintendo won for good reason. Famicom, Nintendo used some dirty tactics. They were they gained. I think they gained a position of power through some dubious financial terms, and I believe they got done for dumping because they were undercutting the competition to the point they went bankrupt. And then they used that to squeeze the resellers of the games and force them to not give returns and things. So I think there was some dirty tactics from Nintendo back in the day. But none of the other systems I've played, the Atari systems at least, could compete with this. On any level. The game, and it's not just the gameplay. It looks great. It's smooth. It's I say the technical. Hardware capabilities are just so nice. Okay. I wasn't aware that was what the Master System returned to. Okay, referred to. Sorry. Okay, well that's interesting. Thank you for that. So yeah, where was I? So yeah, I don't know. The only thing I would sort of say is. In some ways, it feels odd to me that the Master System didn't do better than it did. When you look at the technical capabilities of it, the NES seemed to always beat it, but I'm not quite sure why, because I don't think the NES had a better CPU. I don't think graphically it really had any significant benefit, and the Master System had this 16-color graphics, and it kind of feels like maybe there was some kind of why didn't the Master System do better? Now I'm just going to pause here. Now, do you see we've got this sort of raising and lowering ceiling here, and then we've got the ground with the tunnel there, with the pit there. Now, do you see there's some kind of glitching just above the pit? Now, what's happening here? You see, if you think about the NES hardware, the NES can only do one tile layer, and it can't do very many sprites. So we've got two things moving here at the same time, and it can't do it with sprites. So what it's doing is it's using the tile map. So the top half of the screen with the ceiling is the tile map. The bottom half of the screen is also the tile map, and actually, technically speaking, the World 1 Mario 3 thing, that's a tile map as well. And so what they're doing is they're chasing the analog gun of the screen as it's drawing, and they're moving the tile map each time to effect scrolling vertically and horizontally. Now that's why, and that's how they're doing it in this case, and that's how they're able to make the ceiling smoothly scroll down. But you're able to move across as well. It's very, very clever what they're doing here. But in this case, and I don't think I've seen it this badly on the real systems, but we've got a very nasty glitchiness there as they're doing the switch. Maybe it's just the analog capture device is capturing it somehow better than the real TV would have. But as I say, that's the kind of trick you often saw on these old systems, because they were often trying to make the hardware do things it simply couldn't do. As in, we want to have a sprite the entire 2/3 of the height of the screen that's coming down on the player. Well, there is no such sprite on the NES, so they tricked the tile map into doing it, the single tile map. Japanese. The Japanese players may well be baffled by it. I'm baffled by it. I bought a bunch of Mark 1 games or something, and they don't work on the Power Base, even though the Power Base is the Mark 3 and the Mark 3 does support them. It does get. It was very confusing. They're quite expensive out here. The hardware itself, the Mark III, is about £100. I bought a very cheap one with no joypads and things, and it does work okay. And then the games are about £30 each. It was cheap. I imported a Western Master System because it's cheap. You can buy a Master System and a huge stack of games for a fraction of the price of the equivalent Japanese one, and then being an absurd obsessive collector, I then went and bought the Japanese one anyway. So I've now got both. But one thing that is very true of the Mark III and the Master System, and it's true of English and Japanese games as well in general, the one that really got to me was, I'm playing like complete pap today. The one that really got to me is Bubble Bobble. I'm a big fan of Bubble Bobble. It's a classic arcade game kind of thing. And I got the Master System version, the UK Master System version, and I put it in, and I started playing it, and it's like, oh, this isn't right. This isn't right. Yeah, it's kind of something's wrong here. Something's seriously wrong. The frame rate, the game's running slow, the music's running slow, and when you jump, the sound of the jumping slow, and you're moving through the air slow, and it was really noticeable. And I'm sure some of you can guess why. It's because the UK TV is 50 hertz and the Japanese one's 60, so they've slowed the game down. And I don't know if that's true of the Mario as well. I kind of don't think it is. I'm not noticing it that much. And even after all these years, as I say, with Bubble Bobble, it was driving me nuts, and I'd never even played the regular version on the Master System, on the Japanese Master System. So I would have thought I'd be noticing a major speed difference on this if there was one. How the hell are you so familiar with Yes, it's not my main hobby. It's all I do now. It's like I'm reading manuals on assembly language at lunchtime. I have a tablet next to my bed with like assembly language on it. If I'm on a train, I'm reading assembly language. If I'm not reading assembly language, I'm putting subtitles on the videos with assembly language. So yeah, and it is difficult though, because I'm forgetting it as fast as I'm learning it, and that's why I'm so bad at gaming, because I don't play games anymore. This is why I'm doing the live streams. It's just an excuse to play the consoles, because they're all sitting gaining dust and rust because I never play them anymore. I got like 30 games consoles here, or certainly 20, and then another 15 PCs and things. Stacks of games on all of these systems. I just don't play them anymore. I can't justify it. It's not that I don't have time, because if I'm spending all this time doing assembly, I clearly do. It feels like it doesn't do anything in the long run. I could sort of take a month off work and play Mario 3 and get back to my former glory as a 13-year-old, but what would that be? is that something to be proud of? It really wouldn't feel like it is. So yeah, at the moment I'm really putting everything I can into assembly language and programming and trying to make content that people can enjoy, and that's what I'm trying to do here. It's like, well, I'm hoping that even with my embarrassing programming skills, maybe a few people will come on and watch and have a laugh at how bad I am and things, but if I can explain a few even trivial things about the hardware itself, and just pass a little bit of knowledge and fascination onto people, maybe they'll follow on to the tutorials later on. Yeah, aspect ratios. I think this one's right. I think I've set it to 4:3, but you're never quite sure with the cropping and things whether even this is correct. So this is what we're playing with today, but maybe it's still wrong. I have seen a particularly egregious one where someone was accusing someone of being fat and they didn't realise the aspect ratio was obviously messed up either on the emulator or on the original video, and it's like, well, you should notice that there's obviously a technical error here, and that's why the person looks particularly large. It's not the person, it's not the actor, it's a glitch, But as I say, but the other one that really gets to me is I don't know if you guys watched James Rolfe, the Angry Video Game Nerd. Now, I know the Angry Video Game Nerd is a character, and he's actually faking a lot of stuff in there. But there's quite a lot of the ones where he's just doing the Let's Plays with Mike, and they're just sort of casually playing games. And sometimes they say such stupid things about the system because they clearly have no concept of the limitations of the hardware. And it's like, you played this your entire life. Surely you've noticed the sprite limitations. Surely you've noticed things flicker if too many things get on a line. And they, I don't know if they're just doing it to troll the audience so the audience will leave them rude comments in the chat. But as I say, it's like, it has got to me a few times because they'll say such obviously stupid things. And the one that really bugged me was, well, it didn't bug me because the other tech guy actually interrupted and pointed out how daft they were being. They said, oh, the Turtles game should have 4 players. It's like, it can barely cope with, this is what the other guy said, it can barely cope with 2, come on, you really obviously have no idea what the hardware limitations are here. But as I say, it's something that's definitely not going to occur in mine if I can manage it. As I say, I'll always be trying to point out where I know what the limitations are and what the tricks are. You won't find me buying any of those retro caching consoles. As I said before, I mean, it's like, I could probably run this through a HDMI box or something and get less analog distortion, but just play it on an emulator. I mean, are the emulators really that bad? I'm sure there's the odd case where they crash and the real hardware wouldn't have or something, or there's a slight graphical glitch, but 90% of the time they're perfect, for an average player. And one of these hardware remake things is no more a real NES than a Raspberry Pi is. Now, I understand that you could say, well, there's legal implications there. Yeah, okay. But in my case, I own pretty much every single game I would ever play on an emulator anyway. I haven't got by no stretch of the imagination do I own every NES game. I don't. But if there's a game that I owned or a game that I wished I'd owned and it doesn't cost the entire value of my bank account, I've probably bought it by now. So it's not like I'm stealing money from anyone by playing an emulator because I've got the real hardware. But what the difference is between the NES Mini and Raspberry Pi is completely beyond me. But anyway, people enjoy that kind of thing. Do whatever you enjoy. I'm not trying to be elitist when I'm saying that. I just feel people are spending money on something that's not doing anything more than their Nintendo DS could do, But anyway, so if it gives people some fun, then let them enjoy it. Now, one other thing I will tell you about that I didn't realise, mostly I sort of learned the hardware limitations of the NES as a kid, just by playing the games and seeing what happened and what didn't happen, and noticing, oh, hang on a minute, there's no background here. That's because there's this ceiling coming down on me at this point. That's probably a good reason for that. And you'll notice that often you'll see the left-hand side of the screen reappearing on the right-hand side, or the colours are wrong on the right-hand side as the tile map's being redrawn because of the hardware limitations of the NES tile map again. Now, one thing I didn't realise is the tiles on the NES are 8 pixels square. Now, everything you can see on this screen, these big sort of pyramid blocks, these grey blocks here, and the lava down there, those are 16 by 16, so they're made up of 4 tiles. Now, the thing I'd never noticed, and that question mark block, of course, that's 16 by 16, so 4 tiles. Now, the reason for that is that in almost all cases, the NES can only set colours in a 16 by 16 square. So you can have the 4 tiles being any permutation or combination of whatever you want, but you can only set the colour for those 4 tiles at a 16 by 16 level, which is a pretty difficult limitation if you were going to try and make your game around 8 by 8 squares rather than the 16 by 16 squares that this is using. So that was something that never occurred to me, but yeah, it's a real limitation of the NES, and that's something that the Master System definitely doesn't have. So let's see if I can get to the Boom Boom guy. I did like the design of Mario on this version. He looked far nicer. He kind of looked a little bit crude in the original. Ah! That was a bit embarrassing. Another casual players understand the power region sometimes for certain again. Oh, okay. Yeah. So that's an interesting point. Yeah, and I'm sure there's some that they sped up for the Japanese release. Yeah, I mean there were problems in both ways, and I think we're lucky now that hardware is essentially working at an internal speed and resolution and then converting for whatever the destination device is now, so that we don't have these kind of problems anymore. But I mean, it was the dark ages back then in a lot of ways, and I mean it all came down to that they were using the same timing chip for the processor as the video chip, and I'm assuming that was in a lot of ways probably a cost saving. I mean, it might have been a technical restriction in that it was almost impossible to do anything with the video otherwise, but as I say, it was essentially a limitation of the chip doing the video was also controlling the processor, and so the game speed would slow down if it needed to run at 50 Hertz. But as I say, it's unfortunate when, as I say, a game like Bubble Bobble, it was really quite frustrating, because as I say, I know what the Bubble Bobble soundtrack should sound like. I know what the character should jump like, and this is only from the other systems, even the NES, even the Amstrad CPC version, which everyone knows is slurs, So I'm kind of saying that I prefer the old Amstrad CPC version to the Master System UK version, because the sound sounds weird, the jumping sounds and moves weird. It drives me nuts. But yeah, I mean, of course, that screen resolution limitation thing was a big thing with DVD. That's another one that's really come about, because you often sort of used to hear on the DVDs and things, people would be getting all wound up because the UK release of Titanic was slightly shorter than the US release, and they thought, oh, something's been removed. And it was just that it was slightly speeding up the film because of the frame rate difference of the US release. And the other thing was that DVD is 720 by 576 in the UK, and in the US it's 740 by 480. And so we had a lot more vertical lines, and I guess that's where the frames were going, the actual data rate. But so I once or twice borrowed US imports from a friend, and you could see that they looked worse. The resolution drop was sufficient that the film would look inferior on the US release. So I think we won out in the DVDs but lost out in the games, I guess I'm saying. But again, thank God for Blu-ray and HDMI and things, that these are all problems from the past. But it's I do think we've lost a bit of the character of the games though, because we don't have any limitations now. Snow on the outside the 50. I don't know about the V-blank, whether that's because of the V-blank. I mean, it might just be because the visible area's possibly bigger, because, as I say, the UK resolution is actually different as well. I really couldn't comment on that. But yeah, as I say, that there were all kinds of problems in those days. Incidentally, a fun bit of trivia for you in Japan today. The two areas of Japan, the north and south area, use different frequencies for their power signals. One area uses 60 and the other area uses 50, and I always forget which is which. And apparently this is like for historical reasons, because when they were setting up the first power generation transformers and what have you, the two areas bought from different companies and they use different frequencies. And even to this day, you know, if you buy like a device that's, you know, like I bought a motorized hair clipper, and you have to buy the right one for the territory you live in, because otherwise it just won't work properly. And as I say, that's modern day Japan. So weird, baffling inconsistencies for historical reasons. Unfortunately, while they've gone with our TVs, they aren't gone in other cases. So yeah. Oh, okay. That's a very interesting, Joel. Thanks for that. I didn't know that about Bubble Bobble Arcade. Truth be told, I never saw an arcade machine of it. My first experience of Bubble Bobble was a friend of mine had a ZX Spectrum, and I used to go around his house occasionally to play the ZX Spectrum, and he had it, and it just became a kind of like, oh, this is a game that I don't own that looks quite fun and quite impressive, and so it became a bit of a like, oh, I've got to get this game for the CPC, and at that time it was actually out of stock everywhere. You could not buy it anywhere, even mail order. And in the end, I think my parents had to sign up for there's this like monthly game club thing. They charge you an absurd fortune to send you games every month, and the games were quite good, but it was like, you know, it wasn't worth the money, I guess, probably. But anyway, they actually did have the game, and so I got the game from that. But as I say, at what cost, I dread to think. But yeah, I never saw a Bubble Bobble game back on an arcade, so my experiences of it are just combined from a variety of old 8-bit systems, and I think I've played it once or twice on emulators, I guess, but on MAME emulators, I mean, but never seen a real machine. But yeah, so it's a nice little game. One I will recommend though for anyone who likes Bubble Bobble that maybe you don't know is it's called Liquid Kids in the West, but it's called Mizupaku Daiboken in Japan, which means Water Tapir Great Adventure. It's basically New Zealand story crossed with Bubble Bobble. The characters throw bubbles of water at enemies, but it's a scrolling platformer, and it's got a lot of the sort of cartoon style of New Zealand stories. So if you like your Bubble Bobble and you like the New Zealand story, that would be one I'd definitely recommend you check out that you've probably never heard of. It's out for the PC Engine, and apparently there was like an early beta for the Amstrad CPC, I think. I think there was some very early leaked screenshots, or maybe a partially working game, but it certainly was never even close to release for the NES, for the CPC. But it's a fun little game, and I have a PC Engine with an obscene amount of games, so we'll be playing that at some point as soon as I've finished embarrassing myself on Mario 3. I know, game over on that. Okay. So let's turn this one off and let's move on to the Ninja Turtles game. Now, the Ninja Turtles game, this is one I played on the arcade. We had this sort of travelling carnival come to our town, and they had it there, and I was absolutely obsessed with it, and I put a ludicrous amount of quarters into it, and I got about halfway through the game and then ran out of quarters. So when it came out, and it was a weird game for the release date, because the game, of course, came out originally. £150 for the PC Engine, isn't it? The game, I don't know how much the game costs. I didn't pay £150 for it, but I buy most of my games loose, not with boxes or anything. As I say, Water Kids might be more expensive, but you want to look for the Mizupaka Daiboken, the Japanese version, because it's probably cheaper. But anyway, as I say, you could play it on MAME if you prefer, but as I say, it's just one that I'd never heard of. That it was like, hey, this is almost like a bubble platformer, and that was always something I thought was missed out on. Okay, bubble for the BBC Micro. I'll have to check that out. That's fascinating. So anyway, so this game, because we all had the Ninja Turtles game already, but the version 1 for all of the systems, and it was despite what some people say, I know the Nintendo nerd hates it, but I used to play it with one of my friends who had it, and my friend could win the game, or at least I saw him get to the Technodrome. So James Rolfe whining about that gap you couldn't get over, my friend managed it, so whatever. Anyway, I thought the first game was pretty good on the NES, and it was a lot of fun on the CPC, and I saw it on the Spectrum as well. So I was quite happy with the Turtles game we had, but then when I saw the arcade game, I thought, yeah, this is incredible, you know. And then for some reason it came out right at the end of the 8-bit era. This was the last game I got for the NES. It came out on the CPC after I'd almost given up on the system. And it came out on almost every system. And for that reason, I have started to come to use it to be a bit of a benchmark whenever I come across an old 8-bit system that I've not heard of before, which doesn't happen much anymore, obviously. But when I do, I tend to... is that supposed to have happened? The sky is above the... I don't know what's quite happened on the screen. Oh no, is that supposed to be water? Okay, anyway, so I often tend to use it as a bit of a benchmark to see what the hardware is capable of as a system. You know, what's the Atari ST like compared to the Amiga, or what's the what's the NES like compared to the Spectrum, or something like that. It's a good one to compare, because it seems to have come out on all of these 8-bits, even though they were really past their prime, and it really, in most cases, it became a bit of a display of the capabilities of the last system. Yeah, Ninja Turtle. Yeah, the good old UK censorship. The Japanese title, I struggled to find Turtles for ages. The first game wasn't called Turtles. It was called Geki Kamen Ninja Den, which means Geki means kind of like excited or invigorous, and Kamen is like no. Kame, not Kamen's mask, sorry, Kame. Kame is turtle, so it's like it's vigorous turtle ninja legend or something like that. It's like, and then they realised, hang on a minute, that's a silly title. So when they released the sequel, they called it Turtles 2, which was more sensible. So that's what we got here. We got Turtles 2, and I've got Turtles 3 as well. I never even knew that came out in the West. But anyway, so when this game came out, I had my CPC still. I didn't have a PC worth any that I could play anything on. It was an old XT, but I also had the NES now, and so I was kind of looking at this game in the NES magazines and in the CPC magazines, and I was trying to work out, well, choices. I can only get this for one system, and especially the NES version, it was about £50. It was insanely expensive, probably because it's got tons of extra hardware in it. Again, this one does have digital sound in it again, so there's hardware for that. But I was sort of like a running eye, and the NES version looked less colourful than the CPC version, but I kind of had a hunch that the NES version would be the better one to get. So this is the one I got. I never played this. I played like a one-level demo, I think, on the CPC, but I'd say this is the version I got. And hang on a minute, is this the right version? Have I bought? Is this the wrong game? I think I've got the wrong game in. I think this is Turtles 3. This is Turtles 3. Just bear with me a moment. This is the thing, because the first Turtles game wasn't called Turtles, they've renumbered them all. So Turtles 3 is now Turtles 2, and I've got the wrong cartridge. Just bear with me a moment. Okay, so Turtles 2 is actually Turtles 3, Turtles is Turtles 2, and Gekikame Ninja Den is Turtles 1. I think we're all following. Okay, let's get this in and see if it... Put all my headphones back in. So yeah, this is more like it, and this is what we would be used to seeing. Okay. Yeah, the UK censors were a bit insane, weren't they? They thought the word ninja was going to corrupt the impressionable youth who, you know, clearly couldn't figure out their ninjas or anything. You know, the word alone would turn them to rabid monsters, which I don't know. I don't know what to make of that. So. Yeah, very true about the joypad. I mean, the Nintendo, the NES joypad is a great layout. I mean, to be fair, the Master System and the PC Engine also have very similar layout, and then the Super Nintendo one for a digital joypad. I can't think of one that I'd prefer to use. The other thing is, and especially with the Nintendo World Cup, the Neketsu Soccer, that's a game that supported up to four joysticks. So they again, not only was the controller very good, but they were thinking ahead with regards to 4-player gameplay. And I don't think, I'm trying to remember if I knew anyone with a multi-tap or not. I have this weird feeling I did, but I don't remember ever playing more than 2 players on it, so maybe I'm imagining it. But anyway, so this is a game that really pushes the hardware to the limits. Atari were insane, weren't they? The 7008, I don't know about that joypad, but I mean the old ones with the phone keypad were legendary. Now, in the early days, I think the phone keypad thing, which again is another thing that the Angry Video Game Nerd made fun of, I suspect it was just a technical thing that they wanted to build a system, and they wanted to use hardware that they'd already got lying around that was in mass production, and so they used basically a phone keypad just because it's like, well, we're not going to have problems sourcing these because they've already been made for phones, but it's like, gameplay wise it was absurd. Now, you know, in the early days of Atari that would have made sense, but to then carry that onto the Jaguar was just like, you know, what were you thinking, you know? But that's true of the Jaguar in general. That's a system and a half. I tried to read the technical manual on it, and it was like, you know, please make it stop, basically. It was pure Atari all the way. The Atari Lynx manual is bad, but the Atari Jaguar manual, it's like, hey, we've got this proprietary graphics system using a proprietary processor, and it's got all these proprietary subsystems, and we're not going to give you any sample code that works with it. Off you go. Thanks for that. But it's interesting because there's always this argument about whether it's a 64-bit machine or not, and what I didn't realise until I read the documentation, I knew it had a 68,000 in it, but the main CPU is a 68,000. The 64-bitness, if you will use that term, it's only the graphics chip. And I mean, this is like the PC Engine. The PC Engine's an 8-bit processor and a 16-bit graphics chip. And, you know, by that argument, the MSX was a 16-bit system. And, you know, there would be a lot of 16-bit systems out there if we were counting by the video card. So, again, it's like, well, I'm not entirely sure that the Jaguar deserves to be called a 64-bit system if only if its graphics card is 64-bit, because, you know, aren't the modern graphics cards like 256-bit or something crazy? You know, like, this isn't the definition we use usually, but as I say, the main problem is that the documentation is terrible, the hardware design's crazy and very, very unusual, and that's why a lot of the games are just basically Amiga ports, and frankly, I couldn't even figure out how to do that, you know, reading the manual. And so it's like, well, you know, I'm sorry guys, but I'm not willing to spend a week and achieve nothing trying to program this stupid thing based on the documentation that was official. Now, I've been talking about a lot of systems other than the one I'm playing, so I apologise for that. Let's move on from that. So, It had a digital sound sample there, of course. Now, again, this is a game that they really designed around the limitations of the hardware, but boy, did they do a good job, because there's not much difference between this and the arcade version. Now, you'll notice there's a heavy limitation on the sprites. You'll often see bits of the sprites disappearing because of the line limitation. You know, sometimes if there's, I think it's 8 sprites on a line, bits will disappear. Midnight Resistance rotatable sticks, never played it. Those rotary joysticks, it's a very nice idea, and it's kind of a shame they never really got to the home systems, I guess. But yeah, I'm a fan of the arcade sticks. It's just, you know, for playing in front of a monitor like this, you know, you end up with them on your desk or something, so or on your knee. So you know, it's much easier with the joypad, and even with the Neo Geo, the real Neo Geo, I tend to use a Neo Geo CD pad just for convenience, even though I've got the bean stick and the square one. So again, we're always working within the limitations of the hardware with this game. So the bottom of the screen, the flames are obviously tile map. They're just rotating between different tiles. The April and Neil in the background, that's going to be tile map again, I would suspect. And then the main character, the turtle, and is that Rocksteady? It's Rocksteady, isn't it? I can't remember which one's which anymore. One's Bebop and the other's Rocksteady. I think Rocksteady with the rhinoceros, he is of course a sprite, and then Shredder comes in, Shredder's a sprite there, and now sprites, and that's tile map again. So now the interesting thing is, in the arcade, okay, the Atari 7800 is one of the ones that people sometimes suggest that I should be trying to cover. There's a lot of systems that I, may cover in future years, but as someone's already commented it, I'm covering so many systems, it's kind of, it starts to melt your brain a bit after a while. So I'm still trying to focus on this. While there's still things I can do for the current systems, I'm going to do them, and then when I really have done everything that's within my ability stroke willpower to do, I will start dropping some of the systems and then add other systems to replace them. That's my current plan. But yeah, I mean, the Ataris completely went me by in my youth. We had an old Pong console. We got a Pong console when I was about 4, I think. I think I saw a Pong console. And then I got one much later with a light gun that was second hand. Yeah, is it 6502 or is it 65C02, the 7800? I think I lose track, but I never knew anyone with an Atari. I never played an Atari. It never occurred to me to buy one, which I would say was surprising, but I think that was true of everyone, which is why they sold so badly, and Nintendo just wiped them off the face of the earth, basically. But as I say, the Lynx, wonderful bit of hardware, terrible documentation. Doesn't remotely surprise me that only it was all first-party titles, because no one else could probably understand the manuals. And the Jaguar, the design, all these all these multiple processors doing the job, that's not going to make the developer make an easy job for the developer, and there's hardware bugs in it and things as well. So again, it's like, well, it surprises me more that Tempest 2000 was a thing. The developer's obviously a genius to manage to pull something like that off on such a complex system. Then it surprises me that it failed, because, as I say, silly controller, silly controller, and it's very bad documentation, weird complex hardware. Now, one thing that's quite interesting on this game is, of course, the arcade game is actually shorter than the NES version, which is why I think that purchasing the NES version was the better choice, because basically you could almost argue it's a better game. Graphically it's not, obviously, but it's very graphically good, and as I say, they've actually made up new levels for a game that was already perfectly large. Now, one of the interesting things is, in the arcade machine, there's a battle. You fight Rocksteady and then Bebop, or the other way around if I've got the names wrong. And then later on you fight them both together. Whereas in this version you fight, I think it's Baxter Stockman in a helicopter thing, which wasn't in the arcade version, I don't think. And I think I'm right in saying that, and the reason was that the sprite limitation of the NES meant they couldn't do that double battle. I'm pretty certain that's why. It seems very unlikely to me they could have done that battle, so I'm assuming the reason they removed that was a technical limitation of the NES. You get anything for doing that? Randomly attacking people on the street? I don't know. interesting comment. European history of 8-bit machines has been eroded. I'm not going to disagree with you. I mean, for me, I don't know. I mean, for me, it hasn't, and for a lot of other people, it hasn't. But maybe. I don't know. I mean, it's been a big swing over the years, one way and the other, hasn't it? I think the other thing is that maybe the Japanese developers are a lot more passionate about their systems. I don't hear Alan Sugar talking about releasing a CPC Mini, you know, whereas all of the, you know, they're even doing a PC Engine Mini now, and it's like, you know, all of the Japanese developers are re-releasing everything. Even the X68000 has a Raspberry Pi, an officially authorized Raspberry Pi case. So you know, they're all, you know, cashing in there and getting it back out there. But as I say, the Spectrum's had the embarrassments, but you know, the Vega, I mean, which is a terrible embarrassment. But you know, there's not been any CPC Mini or BBC Mini, and you know, it'd be nice if there was. There was the BBC Microbit, which has caused all kinds of Google search engine problems, because now whenever I search for the BBC Micro, trying to program, everything that comes up is the Microbit, which, I'm sorry, but the BBC, the current generation BBC Micro is the Raspberry Pi. I don't know what the BBC thought they were messing around with creating that silly Microbit. It's like, it's not comparable to the original BBC, and you know, we're like, you know, 30 years on. It's, if you want to release a new series of TV and kids games, kids programming system, great, do it. But you know, putting a tiny little CPU on a USB dongle with a bunch of wires on the end, it doesn't really seem comparable to the already existing Raspberry Pi, which is far, far more powerful. And you know, these days you can even use as a complete system if you want. The new conversion of Pinball Dreams. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because in a lot of ways, the BG group, do they call themselves now? They've stopped using the B word because of, I'm sure, copyright reasons. So yes, I mean, what can you? They're almost too good for their own good now, because everyone just assumes sheer magic from them when they do keep delivering. But I mean, for me, it was like with never any doubt they were going to deliver a product of that standard, just because they seem to. I mean, they seem to have basically worked out the Amstrad hardware better than anyone else has in the history of the Amstrad hardware somehow. I say that you see that Vespertino thing, and I look at that and I almost cry imagining the debugging hours. And everyone else is going, oh, well, when's it out? And you're like, well, I'd be more asking, are you actually going to be able to finish it without having a nervous breakdown? You know, because it looks to me like a programming nightmare, a debugging nightmare. It looks to me like the kind of program you would develop, test on real hardware, and find it's unplayable and unfixable because you didn't think to try on a certain combination of random hardware that was released in Spain once or something. It's incredible the stuff they do. And I mean, I think the reason the pinball game was so good is they've managed some very, very good vertical scrolling using the CRTC tricks. They've got some very good compiled sprites for the board animation and what have you. As I say, they're really pushing everything to the limit, and the problem with that is the further you push things to the limit, the more problems you have and the worse those problems are going to be. And that's what terrifies me about Vespertino, because it's like, well, when you look at what that's doing, and I mean, I did a very simple example of just doing some CRTC bending, and I tried to do one of RVI, rupture vertical invisible, which is backwards, but it's a French term. So I tried to do it. I couldn't get it to work. Even for a crude example, I couldn't figure it out well enough to get it to work even once in a still frame. And they're probably doing it every single line multiple times for that Vespertino example. It just blows my mind. I say I can only even begin to imagine what they must be doing to build a frame that fast and that complex on a system like the CPC, and they're going to pay for it in debugging if they if they aren't able to figure it out in their minds, basically, or on calculators or whatever, they're gonna, if they don't do that perfectly, they will be in debugging hell, basically. And I'm not saying they won't. I'm not saying that they aren't clever enough to do it, because they've shown no signs that they aren't clever enough to do it. I just know in full well time, in 6 months' time, people will be whining, saying, "Where's Vespertino?" And it's like, well, people are expecting. They're so used to having miracles, they're now expecting them, and they're now disappointed when they're not being delivered, by the bucket load, And so it's just, it's frustrating, because you know full well that. I mean, Batman Group will never make a penny out of the Pinball Dreams game now because of the licensing problem, which it's kind of their fault for using a licensed product. They could have made Pinball World or Batman Dreams or something. Yeah, they could have made a similar game, but okay, they wanted to do wanted to sort of beat the Amiga with its own game. Well, fair enough. I fully understand that, but the problem is that means they've not got their own licensed IP, so it's unfortunate. But say with the Vespertino one, it's like, well, let's say they released it tomorrow and it was amazing. How many people would even buy it? They're not going to make they're not going to make a living wage off releasing it, even if they do release that miracle. Inconsistent crashes on various chipsets. Yes, exactly. Yep, that's what you get. I mean, loads of the demos, the Futures demo in the recent 30-year anniversary, it doesn't work on my real hardware. It doesn't even work on a lot of emulators, and it's like that's what happens when you push it too far. Your demo doesn't work, and that's another thing that bugs me a bit. You get people say, "Oh well, imagine if this game had been released back in the 80s, like with the Batman Group, Vespertino, or the Pinball Dreams, or a lot of other games as well." And it's like, well, there's a reason it wasn't released back in the day. It's because they couldn't take the risk. Because if you wrote a game that was pushing things to the absolute limit of the currently available hardware, and then the following day, Amstrad had announced a new version of the hardware with a slightly different chipset because a different manufacturer was making it now, and your game simply didn't work, and you simply couldn't get it working. Well, that could be the end of your company, not just a delay to the game release. That could be, we're declaring bankruptcy because we can't pay the staff anymore because we've run out of money and we weren't expecting a 6-month delay for a rewrite. So, I understand. It's nice to sort of imagine what these games could have done back in the day and things, but it also kind of fails to understand the serious limitations that were put in place on the programmers back in the day, just because they didn't have emulators, they didn't have all of the technical documentation of every CPC that was ever released, because some of those weren't released yet, and they didn't have the financial limitations on a company. I mean, I'll be honest that a lot of the time when I'm asked to do things in my day job, whatever they are, programming or anything else, there's quite often times where someone will ask me, well, can you do X? And I'll say, yes, it'll take 3 days, or it'll take half a day, just depending on what it is. And they'll say, it's not worth it, then just forget about it. Because they're working on, financial time constraints, and they're thinking, well, Keith's salary is X, so if Keith spends half a day, it's effectively costing Y, and it just isn't worth that. So they'll just say, forget it. And that's the kind of limitation that the 8-bit developers of the 80s and early 90s will have been on. They will have been on that we've got to get the game out in 6 months or our company's going under because we can't pay the salaries anymore. The BBC Micro, well, I mean, the BBC Micro doesn't have hardware sprites, does it? I mean, the BBC Micro is a 2 MHz processor. It's twice the speed of the C64. Basically, when I ported Grime Z80 to the 6502, the BBC version ran it fine, and it looked almost the same as the CPC version, but the C64 version was horrendously slow because it had half the CPU speed. So the 2 MHz BBC processor is about the same as the 4 MHz Z80, and that's because the Z80 is less efficient megahertz for megahertz than the 6502. I'm fully happy to admit that, it's definitely true. But whether the hardware sprites would make enough of a difference, I don't know. But if the C64 version can do Mario that well, I would be pretty certain that the BBC could at least do something that everyone would thoroughly enjoy, even if it would arguably be slower because of having to simulate hardware sprites. So I would say yes, it would be able to do it. The BBC is, I would say the BBC is my favourite of the 6502 systems, the computer ones. The consoles are probably the PC Engine maybe, or, well, I mean the Lynx is a great bit of hardware, it's just a shame it's so badly documented, but the BBC is my go-to if I'm looking to do a bit of pure coding. You know, I just want to test a random number generator, or I just want to try writing a 48-bit addition routine or something. The BBC is my go-to one for that. It starts up very fast, it's got a very nice screen, it's got a simple memory map. I tend to find the C64 tends to start up a little bit more slowly, and the processor's a little bit slower, and the graphics, I'm not so much of a fan of the graphics. It's got the two color. The graphics are essentially sort of half the color depth of the Amstrad in some ways. It's got the 4-color mode, which is 160 by 200, which the CPC has the 16-color mode at 160 by 200, and it has the 2-color mode, and it has the 2-color mode on the BBC, on the C64, sorry, that's the 320 by 200 of the CPC. And now I fully understand that though the C64 uses tile-based colour attributes, but as I say, for convenience and for just getting things working, I prefer the BBC. Stunt Car Racer on the 128 Master, very fast and playable. I'm not really familiar with the Master. Does it have a faster processor? I apologise, that's not a system I know really that much about. I understand it's an upgraded BBC, but I don't know the extent of the upgrades off the top of my head, so I can't comment on that. But yeah, as I say, the BBC, 2 megahertz on a 6502 is a lot. You know, it's not as much as something like the Lynx or the PC Engine or the Super Nintendo, God forbid. You know, it's 3 megahertz and heavily upgraded 6502 processor as well. But as I say, 2 megahertz of 6502 is at least 4 megahertz of Z80. And you know, even I'm a CPC fan, but I'll be happy to admit that in a pure processor power for processor power battle, the C64 demos seem to be better to me, or at least I would struggle to find a demo on the CPC that beat the C64 that wasn't relying on the CRTC tricks of the CPC, which, as I say, implies to me that the 1 megahertz C64, when used in the right way, is able to compete with the 4 megahertz Z80, which is, as I say, a remarkable thing if you think about it. Now, the C64 screen uses less RAM, so that probably helps. But as I say, it does seem to me that for a clever programmer, the 6502 is able to do a job that massively outbeats the potential you would expect from the hardware. 2 megahertz with more, 65 CO2. Yeah, well, I'm not sure if the CO2 is. I think the CO2 is faster just inherently. So a 2 megahertz 6502 will be beaten by 2 megahertz 65 CO2 if my memory serves me correct. But it also has extra commands. And it has it has a few commands that are like, well, you know, I wish I'd had that on the 6502 kind of thing. So, okay. So, let's do the Neketsu soccer. Now, Neketsu is like hot-blooded. That's Japanese for hot-blooded, so it's hot-blooded soccer. Now, Neketsu, you probably know this, but it was a big series of games, and they're all kind of wacky and kooky, and they have this kind of comical style to them, which, as I say, just makes it even more baffling that they, I guess like Mega Man, they just got an artist and go, hey, we got a soccer game, and they just put a regular screen on it so it looks like any other soccer game would. I can't be bothered to read all that. And so, as I say, you play, if you're an actual soccer fan, which I'm categorically not, goodness knows what you'd think when you came across this thing when you're literally beating the players unconscious and things. I don't remember how to play this, can't remember. Now, I do remember the trick. There's a trick to this game. What you do is you stand in the middle of the court here, and then you tell one of your players to pass, and then you press both buttons and you do like this jump kick, and it will actually knock out any players who are in the way. So I do enjoy watching the ridiculous faces on the players when they get knocked out. See, I needed to do that from further away. The ball wasn't in the air. So yeah, you need to do the kind of the super move is a bit overpowered in this, I guess, but. There we go, that's the super move. Now if any of the players get in the way of that, it will actually knock them unconscious, so it's, as I say, it's massively OP, but it's I'll be honest, it's kind of, you can get quite far in this game just with that one move. It's a bit silly really, but this is before the days of online updates where they would fix the unbalances in the games, so we can use that and we can get really far in the game if we want. I'm just distracted because I'm enjoying this game too. I'm enjoying this one too much, so I'm not talking. But, anyway, so this was a game that this had 4-player support, which, say, when you think about it, was incredible for such a limited game, for such a limited system. I mean, now if you'll notice you can beat up all the other players, and if you hit them often enough, they will actually not get back up, so you'll kind of knock them unconscious or something. And but there is a limitation. You can't like wipe out the entire opposing team. I think you can like knock half of them unconscious, but then the other half will become immortal effectively, and so you can't take it down to the level where you're the only player left standing, which is, I guess, would have been fun. I've not seen Konami Soccer for the MSX. I mean, I'm not sure what the sort of. I'm trying to think what Neketsu has come out. I mean, there's even a new version like out for the 3DS or something. So, or even like the. I can't remember. It's come back. There's been a reprisal of it, and there's versions for the Advance and things. There's a version for the PC Engine. One of the dodgeball game came out for the PC Engine, so it can't be a Nintendo license. It can't be an outright Nintendo license. So I mean, I'm just wondering if maybe it's the same game, is what I'm saying. Without checking online, I wouldn't be able to comment. But I guess if it came out for the PC Engine, then it's certainly possible that it was actually a port. But yeah, so I think we need more of this, spoof sports game for non-sports fans, I guess is what I'm saying. It's I have no interest in playing a real sports game, but a silly game where you get to knock your opponents out like something out of Mortal Kombat's a bit amusing to me, But yeah, there's a whole series of these. They're all kind of weird, and they've always got the same designed characters, they always look kind of similar, so it's a whole series of these spoof games. Missed it. But I mean, it's quite impressive really how little the sprite limitations of the hardware affect this game. I guess because the characters are generally quite widely spread out across the screen, that they don't become so much of a limitation, maybe. But Oh, the cheerleader's giving them a pep talk here. I can read the hiragana and katakana in these games, but it is harder. I mean, one thing that when you're trying to learn Japanese, in the early days you always learn hiragana first, and then later you evolve to katakana. But it's actually easy later to kanji, sorry. But it's actually easier to read kanji than hiragana or katakana, because a kanji has an entire meaning to it. So, you know, 2 kanji is a word, but it will be like 6 letters usually or something like that. So it's kind of ironic that you might think, oh, well, this game's going to be easier for a non-native speaker because it's only got hiragana, but it's actually the opposite. I'm far better at reading the games on the Game Boy Advance or the Nintendo DS that have a full kanji set, because it's far easier and certainly quicker to read. So I say that's often a misconception, that even Japanese people usually think that, like, non-native speakers will struggle with they always think that katakana, the Western replacement alphabet, is going to be easiest, and then hiragana, and then kanji, and it's the other way around. Non-natives prefer the kanji if they can read it, obviously, some can't, but they prefer the kanji because all of the meaning's in there, and even if you don't know what the word means phonetically, you can understand it from the symbols, because the symbols, like in this, it's hot and blood. Well, you might not know what nekketsu mean, but you can damn well guess what hot and blood means. And the katakana, well, firstly, you see it less. Katakana's only used for foreign words, whereas hiragana's used for everything, like word endings and things. So just from familiarity, the foreigners tend to be better with hiragana. And the other thing is katakana, I mean, maybe it's just psychological, but I find it harder to recognise the symbols, and it tends to look a bit less fluid, so my eyes tend to read hiragana more easily. But as I say, that could just be psychological, just because, as I say, you see hiragana more. But the Japanese think it's the other way around. They think that foreigners are good at katakana and bad at hiragana, and worse at kanji, but that's completely backwards. So I really don't bother trying to read the text in a game like this. If it was a game on the PS2, then I would be, because as I say, it's all kanji, and it's high-res fonts, nice, easy to read, and I find it a lot of fun trying to read them. I learned a lot of Japanese by playing DS games and PSP games and things, just because, you know, at the time I was taking long train journeys, and you can carry that kind of thing around with you. You can play a game and you can learn at the same time. So that was learned a lot of Japanese from the games back then. But anyway. Okay, they're just talking about swapping over teams there. It's quite boring. I thought maybe there was some good joke in there, but there isn't. Yeah. I guess this is kind of a very simple game if you think about it. I mean, graphically speaking, there's a lot of sprites on screen, but there's nothing very complex going on. I mean, if you were looking for a game to write, you know, as a sort of first game, I guess maybe sports games are a good choice for you. You know, from the point of view of you've not got complex level maps, you've not got complex game logic beyond the first level, in the sense that all of the levels in this game are just progressively more difficult teams, and that's just a question of, you know, changing the balancing rules of the players themselves. So if you were looking to develop a game and you were looking for something you could do relatively easily as a beginner, then some kind of sports game would be a good choice. And of course, I guess the ultimate example of that would be Pong, you know, because Pong is I don't think there's any way of stopping that ball. So one moment, just check the chat here. I've not seen any updates on the chat for a while. Okay, I was just checking. No one was. My chat windows on the PC had sometimes got stuck and not shown updates, so I was just checking no one was talking when I was missing it. So anyway, I'd say this is quite a fun little game, and not too complicated. But the multi-tap, it's quite complex the way it talks to the hardware. You know, you have to program some extra commands in to read the extra ports and things. Now, one interesting thing about when I was writing my tutorials, I started writing the NES reading joypad reading routine tutorial, and then I went on to the SNES reading tutorial. And there's actually two ways of reading the SNES controllers. One, basically you're using the firmware, if I remember correctly, and the other you're going directly to the hardware. Now I always try and go directly to the hardware when I'm programming, because I just prefer to do it that way, and also if you're disabling interrupts and things, then you don't have to worry about the firmware. But I was reading it and I suddenly realised, well, they're actually the same. The routines for reading the NES keyboard and the routines for reading the SNES keyboard, joypad, are almost identical. It's just the SNES one's got this extra bit tagged onto the end. So I had to do a quick rewrite and make the code match, because I'd written them both independently at totally different times and hadn't noticed until that point. And so I rewrote them to match. And then you think, well, are you aware of cross? I mean, I've heard of Retro Virtual Machine. I've not looked into it. I mean, is this like a an SDK for programming, where the SDK handles the graphics routines and the sound routines, and then you program those routines? Is it something like that? I mean, I'll just go ahead and, because the delay, you won't. I assume it's something like that. Now, personally, I'm not interested in programming something like that. As I say, I always go back to the direct hardware, and there's two reasons for that. Firstly, that's kind of the fun of it for me, learning about the hardware. So if something else is doing that work for me, then that sort of educational point of view is gone. But the other thing is, if you program for something else and your code doesn't work, you then have to start asking yourself, what don't I know about the something else? Whereas if you go back to the native hardware, then you're down as low down as it goes, and the only problem you've got then is the hardware or your emulator. I was having some trouble with the Phoenix 256 today, and I think there's actually a bug in the processor emulator of the simulator itself. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I've got nothing against that kind of thing if people want to program that kind of thing. If you're looking to quickly write a game and that's the way that you want to do it, then, you know, what I've said before, whatever gets you the target you're looking to achieve, you know, if that's assembly, C++, if that's a retro virtual machine, if that's basic, do it. Just achieve what you're trying to do. For me, I want to go back to the real hardware and learn about the hardware, so it's certainly not something I'd look at. I'm looking to go as low down as I can and make things work from there. So yeah, I mean, I didn't know that one was. I thought that was an emulator, I'll be honest. I mean, there are other ones. There's some C or C++ development tools for the Amstrad CPC. And again, I say, if I fully understand that kind of thing will allow you to do what you're trying to do faster than the way I do things, which is going into assembly and doing it all myself. But I mean, essentially, what in a lot of ways the tutorials I'm writing is trying to do is to write that in assembly, to write a development kit with common functions like print char and locate and read joystick routines that return common data in common ways across multiple systems. So as I say, in a lot of ways, that's almost what I'm trying to do anyway. But as I say, I'm perfectly happy to be writing code that doesn't work because I have made a mistake. I'm perfectly happy to be writing code that doesn't work because I don't understand that underlying hardware properly. I would find it very frustrating if my code didn't work because of bugs or of limitations or even changes in an underlying library that I was using to develop my code, and that would be a serious risk. You know, if I wrote a game, if I wrote Chibi Akamas using Retro Virtual Machine version 1 or something, and then they upgraded it, maybe my code wouldn't even compile anymore if they'd changed the standard, or if I'd misunderstood and I'd been doing things that shouldn't work before but did and now didn't. When you're going down to the low-level hardware, if you've tested on the real hardware and it works, then that's never going to be taken away from you, is it? I did have a big problem with, I was doing some C++ programming a lot of years ago. I was writing a video compressor and a decompressor, and it was driving me up the wall because it's like I can't compile that anymore. I can't compile my own code anymore because when I try and download the latest libraries, the OpenGL libraries I used to use are now obsolete, and this is like a common problem, and it really bugs me. It's like, you know, you're taking my own code away from me effectively, because the libraries I used to rely on don't work anymore. And what's that ARM processing, is it DevKit Pro, the ARM programming kit? I wrote a viewer for this video codec I wrote for the Nintendo DS, and I tried to download it to install that, and they won't let you download the old versions anymore. And there's loads of people screaming that they can't compile old code anymore because it doesn't work on the new versions, and the old versions are obsolete. And it's like I say again, if you're compiling your own code, then you've got a chance of avoiding that kind of thing, is what I'm saying. And it's that kind of thing, avoiding that kind of thing, that is the reason I'm programming 30-year-old consoles. I just want to program for the fun and achievement of programming, and if all I'm relying on is the assembler, then I've kind of gone as low as I can get, and even that is causing some problems. Recently I ported my SNES example, the Hello World example on the SNES, to the 65816 processor, and I was using ASW, the assembler, and I had to rewrite a bunch of the commands to cope with the differences in that assembler, and I thought everything was fine. And then I realised that there were a bunch of limitations in that assembler that meant that I couldn't actually use the full, I couldn't figure out how to use the full 65816 instruction set, because if it supports it, I don't seem to be able to find the documentation on how. So I then had to switch to another assembler, and all the rules had changed. So the new assembler is case sensitive, so I had to do a bunch of searching with places to fix that. All of the commands like ifdef and endif, they have to be prefixed with a full stop, so I had to do a full bunch of searches with places on that. But I got it working in the end, so it wasn't too bad. But before that, I'd looked at another assembler, which is I forget what it's called, it's T64 or something. It was one that a lot of people were recommending for the Phoenix 256 development, but I couldn't use that because it doesn't support the ifdef command at all, and they said it never will. And then that was like, well, that's kind of that's a showstopper for me, because that's how I program. I use ifdef statements for all of my different platforms, and I add platforms later, and that's how the old code is able to ignore the platforms it doesn't understand. And as I say, the point I'm making is that just even if all you're relying on is an assembler and your own assembly source, changes in the assemblers could take away your ability to keep compiling your own code, and that drives me up the wall. So the thought of using extra libraries from other people would really be a no. I'll pass on that, thank you. I'll stick to my simpler games in assembly, because I'm programming for personal achievement, not for writing code quickly or efficiently. It's not. We're programming 30-year-old computers. It's not about writing the games quickly, cheaply, or writing the best game known to man. It's about what can I achieve, and do I enjoy that achievement? And for me, that's going into basic assembling. What do I think is the best fighting game of the 8 bits? Beat 'em ups. Now that's tough, isn't it? Ooh. Well, I mean, I'm trying to honestly think of the first time I even came across a beat 'em up before Street Fighter 2, and I can't, is the truth of it. So I don't think I can really. Would you count Mortal Kombat, because that came out on everything? So that came out on the 8 bits, whereas Street Fighter 2 really didn't, with very slight exceptions. I mean, it came out on the Game Boy Color, for example, but it was even on the Color, it was awful. So I mean, Barbarian's very well thought of. It's never been one I've been into, but would you count that as well? So yeah. Yeah, I'd either go for Mortal Kombat or Barbarian, but that's purely from inexperience. International Karate IK2 is one that people shout about, but again, it's not one that I've ever really been too thrilled by. The fighting game genre, the one-on-one fighting game, sort of started and ended with Street Fighter 2 for me in a lot of ways. Because I saw it in an arcade. That was when we got a SNES, so I got the SNES version, and that was great. I later came across Mortal Kombat on the PCs, but yeah, I think I kind of moved on to other types of game after that, and never really got to it. The only time I sort of even remotely got interested in the fighting games again was with the when I got the Neo Geo, and even then it's like I've never really played any of them for any significant time. Okay, Bangkok Nights. Okay, well I'll have to have a look at that. Do you know if the sprites are hardware or software sprites, out of curiosity? Because I say the C64 is relatively limited on its hardware sprites, but again it's another one of these ones where the developers are very clever and they switch the sprites around all over the place to emulate much larger sprites, which is a very, very common trick on the C64. But well, let's turn this off because I'm not even paying remotest attention to playing the game. Let's give the gun knack game a go then, and we'll see how that goes. So this is one that I don't even know if this came out in the West. Mixture of hard and soft. Okay, well that's yeah, I mean that's a good way of doing things if you can. I mean, software sprites are kind of easy in the sense that you're not worrying about hardware limitations, and if your game can work within only hardware sprites, then again you can just not worry about your background. But if you are doing a combination of the two, then then you're kind of really pushing things to the limit, and so that's often what you're doing if you're trying to really make your game impressive. Of course, you can't easily do that if you're working on tile maps. These tile map based systems, because you're limited on the 8x8 grid, everything tends to be software sprites, like a game like this for example. So this is a game I'd never heard of. When I started writing the Chibi Akamas game, I just sort of did a few casual searches for best shoot 'em ups on all of these systems, just as a sort of bit of a research project, I guess. And this one came up, and I kind of like the weird enemies. It doesn't look too weird yet, but there's like rabbits shooting. There's rabbits shooting carrots, and I mean we got like is that a power-up? Was it? We got like this octopus or something coming down here, and now you can see that the game scrolling is massively fast here. So of course everything in front of this background, as we were just discussing, everything in the foreground is going to be sprites. It's got to be. Now the background scrolling there will be scrolling so fast because they're not even updating the tile map. It was just the same screen scrolling over and over again. We've got those like enemies on the ground. Of course that's all tile map there. It's just very simple. The score will be sprites on this one. The NES has no second layer. The Game Boy has a limited second layer known as the window, which is designed for like if you think of your Zelda, when you pause the game and it shows you your inventory or something like that, a sub window will open up above the normal window and it will show some stuff. Or in other games it might be used for like an on-screen display all the time. I don't think the NES has anything like that. Now in some cases, I think in the games maybe they used that window for parts of bosses and things. I'm not familiar with that fire track shooter. I'm sorry, I'll have to plead total ignorance on that. I don't know what that means. I don't know what that game is, sorry. But I'd say this is quite a cute little shooter, I think, and unlike some of them, it's not. Here we got space rabbits here, of course. What else would there be? I guess when they were sending dogs and things into space as experiments, maybe a bunch of space rabbits have colonised a planet or something, and now they're firing carrot missiles at me and wiping me out. The Turtles game, in one of the later levels, there's snowmen, and that was the level that was added to the game because it wasn't in the arcade. But there's this winter level where all of a sudden it gets snowy, and there's the snowmen and they shoot carrot missiles as well. So that's a kind of unexpected theme here. I have no idea what this is supposed to be. This looks like an asteroid and it's firing Christmas crackers at me or something. Am I even hurting it? Oh, I have some kind of smart one. Okay, well, I should have used that by now, shouldn't I? So, yeah, it's interesting you got all these pieces of text at the top of the screen, so as I say, they must be sprites, and that must be using a fair bit of the sprite limit for those lines, really, if you think about it. It's another thing that you've really got to... Is that an extra life? Oh, it's some kind of power-up. You've really got to think when you're designing your game of just what the limitations of the hardware are and how you're going to do everything, really. If you came up with a crazy idea of a game with very complex weapon mechanics that you actually needed a full-time on-screen display to configure or to check the status of, well, an overlay like that could use up all your sprite limitations. So some of the games that do have, like Mario 3, where you've got that P thing, that wasn't an overlay just because they wouldn't have been able to spare the sprites, of course. So they had that as a separate section at the bottom. But then again, that then causes problems for the tile map, because if you've only got one tile map, so they were having to reposition the tile map midway down the screen to allow for the top half to have the multi-direction scrolling in the bottom half to be static. So, how am I doing it? Yin Yang symbol. I'm not sure what that is. Of course, the PC Engine is really the king of even retro gaming. Yeah, I totally agree. 10-minute games. I've got a PS3. I haven't got a PS4. Belongs to the list to be okay. Oh, thank you. It's not something I knew. Okay. Is there any explanation for the space rabbits? That's the question. But yeah, I back when I was at uni and things, I used to play Half-Life and games like that, and I've won Half-Life, Half-Life 2 and things, and Half-Life 2 is about 60 hours of gameplay or something crazy, there is a certainly an enjoyment, and I do like playing those games, and I still occasionally go back and play them a bit and things, and I did actually complete Half-Life 2 recently, but I can't feel any sense of pride in spending 60 hours playing a game. It's more like I've wasted 60 hours. I could have done anything I could have done in that time could have been better than playing a game for 60 hours. So as I say, I just tend to play the 10-minute games on the DS. I use a lot for playing retro games now, just because it's like you just switch it on, play it on an emulator, switch it off again. You don't have to worry about. With the PC, I'm often worrying about is the joypad set up right, and things like that. Whereas the DS, the joypad's always the emulators are all pre-configured for the joypad without any messing around with settings, and so as I say, it's pretty good. And the real hardware like this, you have to find all the analog cables, get it wired up, then you find the game doesn't work, and you have to spend half an hour cleaning it and things. So I don't even play the old real hardware much anymore, which is why I was thinking of doing this series. Of course, if you're into your shooters, specifically your vertical shooters, really, the PC Engine, I think, is the king for that. Dark Souls, okay. 300 hours, good God. Well, I mean, it's even if... I mean, the other question that I think often comes in is, can you even complete them at all? I got in an argument with someone about Half-Life because I cheated on the last boss of Half-Life because I couldn't win it, so I got a cheat mode off the internet. And a guy I used to work with, he was sort of criticising me, saying, "Oh, cheating to win a game's not properly winning it." Well, have you won Half-Life? No, I haven't won Half-Life. You're like, well, okay. I kind of think seeing the end of the story is more important than not playing the end of the not seeing it. So I take on board what you're saying, but I think you're not in a position to claim that. But to say the number of people you sort of meet and they play these games and they'll play them for a while and they lose interest or run out of time and never even get to the end feels a bit disappointing, really. That say with Half-Life, everyone talks about the story of it a lot, and most modern games are more about the story than the actual pure gameplay, aren't they? There's usually in modern games some kind of arcing story or some kind of narrative they're trying to tell you. It's not just about blowing up space rabbits or, you know, knocking out players. I mean, Mario 3 didn't have a story, did it? Not in any sense of the word. Just rescue some princess and defeat some turtley things. So all the modern games do have a story, and it does kind of occur to me that I suspect a lot of the people who buy these games never even learn the story or get even far enough to start to get involved in it. But that certainly seems to be what people want these days. So if that's what they want, then let them have it. I prefer one game that I did get a lot of enjoyment out of was the Devil May Cry 3 game, and that's a story-based game that has a lot of gameplay. But what I used to do with that is, if I came in after work and I just wanted something to play for 10 minutes, I'd replay one of the early levels. And that game, whenever you played an old level, it would let you collect like power-ups that you could then cash in for upgrades later on. So retro YouTubers I follow, no, not really. I tend to watch the Angry Video Game Nerd episode, the sort of the story episodes. I occasionally watch a few of the smaller ones, but I don't tend to watch many of them, to be honest. Most of the time I watch YouTube, I'm actually programming, and I tend to watch sort of more chatty stuff that isn't going to distract me, shall we say? You know, just kind of chatty nonsense for background noise. So I don't tend to watch YouTubers like that. You know, if someone's reviewing a product, I'm not going to watch that, because I'm either not going to be paying attention to the product, or it's going to be actually distracting me from what I'm trying to work on, which is writing tutorials. So I don't tend to watch that kind of thing. I do occasionally watch playthroughs. Recently, I sort of the suffering that game. I suddenly had an urge to play that again and again. It's like, well, if you play that, you're going to be doing nothing for a day at least. And so you're like, well, okay, I won't play it. I'll just watch someone else play it on YouTube. So I will often watch long plays of games that I simply don't have the time or the willpower to play again, but I would like to reminisce on a little bit. So I play those, but I play them. Sorry, I watch those, but I don't watch ones with. Generally, I don't watch ones with narrative, because again, it's like, well, that's going to get distracting. I just want something on in the background while I'm working. So I catch the Zyphy and the Novabug streams occasionally, but really it's more about the reason I watch those occasionally is more about trying to support the small people who are, you know, kind of, they aren't doing it for the money and they aren't doing it for the attention, because, as I say, they've only got a few thousand subs and they've only got a few dozen viewers, so they're doing it for the chance to talk to people with similar interests to them, and they're doing it for the love of the games or the community or whatever. But as I say, I want to try and show a bit of backup for them, but I don't tend to watch them much. I mean, the ones that I'm more interested in watching, but even this I don't tend to do as much as I should, is the hardware, the people who are actually working on electronics. EEV blog, I tend to binge watch it from time to time, but again, I can't watch that and work on other things, because that's like, that's beyond my technical skill. So if I'm going to get anything from watching that, I've got to just sit there and stare at it and just do nothing else. So it's not something I actually watch very often, just because, as I say, it's like that's the, hey, I don't want to do any programming today, I'm just going to sit here and watch TV kind of days. So, and there's not really many or any of those at the moment, so I don't watch that kind of thing. But I do have a lot of respect for those, and the EEV blog especially is one of the sort of ones that I find very inspirational, just from a point of view of, you know, it's like, if I could make that kind of standard of content for programming that he does for electronics and hardware repair, that's really, if I had a goal, that would be it, if you know what I mean. That's really the thing you would try and aspire to. So I do have a lot of respect for that guy. But as I say, the smaller YouTubers are the ones who I tend to show most support for, from the point of view of, you know, watching the content. How early is early for you? When I'm covering the VIC-20, I've used the ZX81. My dad had one when we got the Amstrad CPC when I was about 5. We did have a ZX81 before that, and my grandfather had one. So I have used one. The memories aren't good. The memories are of crashing, I'll be honest. I mean, the joke in Med Dwarf that this thing's crashed more than the ZX81 was funny because it was true. So I mean, I'm not going to say never to any of these systems. Definitely not, because as I say, the content I'm making now, I release it a little bit early for the patrons, but everything that comes out for the patrons eventually ends up on the channel for everyone. There's no hidden content, with the exception of ones where I appear on camera. I'm not too much of a fan of appearing on camera, so I do have some hardware reviews and things that have me on camera that I don't show. But all I'm saying is all the other videos are available to anyone, and I've now reached the end of the content that I've got pre-prepared. A lot of the tutorials, the source code was written last year, and it was just this year I was writing the documentation and doing the notes and the videos, but that's all now finished. And so the new videos I'm going to have to do from here onwards are actually going to have to be, I've got to learn something new, then document it, then actually make the videos. So that's going to mean a content slowdown, and there will become a point where I just can't figure anything out fast enough, or I can't figure out anything else out, period, to be worth writing the tutorials on. And at that point I will start looking at other systems, and the ZX81, the Acorn, I'm not going to rule any system out. I will write, let's put it this way, I will write tutorials for any system that I am technically capable of learning content well enough to teach people about, that people are interested in. I'm not going to write a tutorial for something that gets one view, because that didn't achieve anything. And I'm not going to write a tutorial for the Atari Jaguar if I can't figure out how to make it work properly, because that's not helpful, you know. And writing tutorials that I know are inaccurate or massively lacking isn't going to help anyone, and it's not good for my reputation either. So I'm not going to do it for any reason. But as I say, with regards to a system that's, I'm not going to declare any system beneath me in the future, but at the moment I've got my hands full with the stuff I'm doing. So when people say, hey, why don't you cover X, why don't you cover Y, my response at the moment is not today, but maybe one day. And that will be the response for anything. We try programming the Archimedes. Yes, I'm programming the Archimedes next year. That's the RISC OS thing, isn't it? Next year I'm going to be doing an ARM series. It's going to be covering the Game Boy Advance and RISC OS, which is basically the Acorn Archimedes, isn't it? So yeah, that's definitely coming. If you watch my 2000 sub video, I showed a very quick preview of RISC OS running a little Hello World example with a bitmap sprite, so that is something I'm definitely doing. ARM is one of the ones I'm quite interested in, from a point of view of, at the moment, I'm trying to cover as much stuff as I can, because I want to make, my goal is to kind of make everyone I can do become aware of my channel. Now, if they see my content and think it's not good enough, if they see my content and they don't like the style, well, there's nothing I can do about that. But I want to try and make everyone become aware of my channel, so that they can, make their judgment, so to speak. So I'm trying to cover as many bases as I can viably do, just to try and work the YouTube algorithm, unfortunately, which is a lot of the case. The YouTube algorithm's a monster to people, especially creators at the moment. I mean, at the moment I'm getting around 700, or we'll call it 700. I'm getting around 700 views at the moment every 48 hours, which is what the live updates show. Now, when I released the X16 videos, a combination of, I think they were spread around Facebook and things, but as well, obviously the YouTube algorithm decided I was pretty hot shit, I guess, and all of a sudden I was getting tons of views, not just on the X16, but on other stuff, like the 6502 series quadrupled in popularity and things like that, and it was which is amazing. And now that's sort of died down again and I'm back to regular view levels. But a couple of months ago I was down to 300 views, and even when I released new videos no one was watching them. Yeah, I am planning to appear on camera at some point. There is there's a couple of things about that. As I say, I have appeared on camera for my Patreons, but it takes longer. You have to sort of start thinking like, well, okay, I've got to position the camera here, I've got to get lighting set up, I've got to get the I've got to dust I've got to hoover the floor, I've got to polish everything, I've got to check I've got not a dirty mark on my face, I've got to change my clothes. It actually becomes a lot of extra work just to make sure you've got an embarrassing spot on your face or something silly that you don't usually have to worry about. So as I say, the actual work of setting things up to record video of myself was easily adding an hour to the recording time of the videos where I was on camera. And most of the videos of me teaching programming take 10 minutes and I don't have to do anything. The mic's already in position, I don't have any cameras, I don't have to worry about what I look like, I don't have to worry about if there's anything weird in the background or what way the camera's looking at or what the lighting's like. So as I say, I understand that. It's just not something I'm particularly comfortable with at the moment, and especially considering when you look at some of the very successful YouTubers, people with tens of thousands of views or tens or hundreds of thousands of subs. Some of them have never appeared on camera in their life, and some of them are getting people trying to dox them and things as well. So yeah. Well, I don't use a lapel mic. I'm using the Yeti Blue thing that everyone uses. I've bought a lapel mic, and I've actually now got a wireless lapel mic, which I was using for the Patreon only videos, where, as I say, I do appear on camera, and I was toying with the idea of making them a bit more sort of humorous and a bit more sort of theatrical. And again, the reason I don't use it is simply time. Using the lapel mic, especially the wireless one, you've got to get like the wireless syncing done. You've got the risk of if it stops working, your audio's not recording, and things like that. And the fixed mic I've got here, I keep it in the same position the whole time, so I can just start talking. I don't have to worry about volume levels, I don't have to worry about mic position or anything like that. So again, a lot of it's about convenience, because it takes a lot of, if I make a 10-minute video, which is, I'm trying to make my videos as short as possible. Let's go back to Mario 1 here. I'm talking more than I'm playing, which is the whole point of this. If I make a video, and let's say it's 10 minutes long, now, a video about something like sprites, hardware sprites. Now, in the case of like the Atari Lynx, that's an extreme example, but it took me 2 evenings to get the Atari Lynx to work, the Atari Lynx sprites working. So that's probably 6 hours of programming time. And I did that last year when I did Grime 6502. It didn't use hardware sprites, but I did it all around the same time. I also had to edit AccuSprite Editor to add new functions to it. And I wrote the early documentation at the time because I knew I'd forget it by the time I actually came to write the proper tutorial. So then I came to do the proper tutorial this year. So this was all done the early work was done last year, and then the new work was this year. And then I had to reread my own documentation. I had to update the source code with some extra comments and just structure it as well as I could, and then write the documentation. And that was about another 5 hours. And then I shot the video, which was about 30 minutes or 20 minutes. And then I edited it down to 10, 12 minutes or 14 minutes, something like that. And the point I'm making is that the 15-minute video or whatever it was, and there would have been a half-hour editing after that as well. So the 15-minute video that I put on the YouTube channel will easily have had 6 hours, and could easily, and in some cases, like the raster examples, that took a week. I was doing a couple of hours programming every evening for a week to get that working. And as I say, the RVI one I couldn't do at all. So a 10-minute video could easily take 10, 12 hours of actual background work beforehand. And so I'm cutting corners with regards to lapel mics and not wanting it to appear on camera and things, but that's because as soon as I finish a video, I'm starting working on the next one, and I just have to do that to keep the content coming, and I have to keep. And you could say, well, okay, well, don't release so much content, but I've gone from one video a week, to one video a day, to 2 videos a day now because I was clearing a backlog of uploaded videos, and YouTube has punished me by dropping my views to half, because they favour people who produce content every day. So if I went down to just doing 1 video a week, for example, YouTube would, even if the viewers didn't care, YouTube's algorithm would punish me for that. So unfortunately, there is a nature that you have to be fast and efficient. And as I say, I don't disagree that a lapel mic would be better, but if I went and did that used the lapel mic and then got to the end of the video and found the cable had come unplugged, or the battery had gone flat halfway through and the video was ruined, then I have to do it all again. So as I say, at the moment, the fixed USB mic, I don't have to worry about the positioning because it never changes. I don't have to worry about batteries or wireless signals, or as I say, the mic being tucked into my clothes and being muffled and sounding weird, or rustling sounds from the clothing or anything like that. So I say I accept that it is the better solution. I just there's so many other things to worry about at the moment that I don't prioritise that. I'm trying to just make do with the fixed position mic. And as I say, from what I see, I see far better YouTubers with far bigger subscriptions than me using the exact same mic I'm using in give or take the exact same position. So I would be surprised if the standard of the audio from the current mic I'm using was the problem. Do you know why most games scroll left to right or top to bottom? Well, you mean opposed to multi-direction scrolling? Well, I mean, part of it's going to be Oh, I see what you mean. Rather than right to left. I don't know. I would guess. I don't think there's a technical reason for it. I would guess it's something psychological. I don't know if it's a right-handed thing, or if it's the way the brain works. I mean, I don't know. I would struggle with that, I'll be honest with you. I mean, of course, Super Mario 3 didn't always scroll left to right. I mean, it certainly did most of the time, but some of the levels didn't. I'm trying to think, is there a single vertical shooter that goes downwards? I can't think of one. I mean, maybe you've hit it there. Maybe you need to create a vertical shooter that scrolls downwards, and maybe that will be a big success. I say it's a good point. I don't think it's a technical reason. It must just be as I say, either maybe there's something about the human brain that things moving to the right feel more natural, or maybe it's just become a thing that everyone expects. Now, I don't think there's any NES reason why this game only scrolls to the right and doesn't scroll to the left. As I say, the hardware-wise, I don't think there's a hardware reason why it couldn't do that. I think it's just the game engine, the software game engine they've written, probably can't do it, or at least doesn't. But as I say, it got especially weird with that Game Boy version that could partially scroll to the left, because it became even more noticeable that, well, hang on a minute, if you're letting me scroll some other way, let me scroll all the way, please. But okay, say it didn't. So that was quite a weird thing. But I think I'm actually playing a little bit better now. Maybe I'm wrong. Oh, yeah, yes, you're right. Luigi's name is Mario, and Mario's name is Mario. Yeah, I'd forgotten that, but yeah, you're right. And there's all this thing about the different princesses, isn't there? This one's princess. Is this one Daisy, and the other one's, or is Daisy the one in Donkey Kong, and this is Princess Toadstool, and then the one in pink with the blonde hair is Peach or something. There's different princesses, isn't there? But and I'm sure you all know this, but there's a quite fun thing about the design of the character. He's of course wearing red dungarees and a cap, and he's got like the big moustache and the green sleeves. And it's all about, it was all designing a character that could be easily represented, easily represented within a very small resolution screen and be clear and visible. So by giving him dungarees, his arms became visible, and by giving him green sleeves, the hands became visible, and by giving him a big moustache, that made the face clearly defined, and the cap, of course, also made the head defined. So, I mean, the point I'm making is that it was really the character that Nintendo have basically made an entire industry out of was really a result of the technical limitations of the hardware. And I think that's something when I designed my Chibico character. 68,000. The Genesis, I think, is the best. The Neo Geo hardware sprites are very impressive, but they're a little bit quirky, and there's no real tile map. So if you're looking to program some 68,000, the Genesis is a good choice. The Atari ST is fine. The Amiga takes a little bit of time to start up, the emulator, but it's perfectly good. The X68000's got some very good hardware as well, and the emulator's quite nice, so that's one. But yeah, if you're looking for a console, then the Genesis, of course. Playing terribly. So yeah, definitely the Genesis. Right, I didn't. Cheat codes. Okay, interesting point. The other thing that modern online gaming has killed is games that actually work on release, isn't it? I mean, even with the PS3 generation, there was no. I mean, some of the machines had online and hard drives, but there was no guarantee that the developers would ever be able to patch things. So, getting worse. They're talking too much, not playing. There was no guarantee they'd be able to patch things, so they actually had to make a serious effort to release a game that actually worked, because otherwise they would have to do a product recall, and that would be horrendously expensive. So yeah, that's a good point though. It hadn't occurred to me. I'm not a fan of this current thing of downloadable content at all. I've got all the consoles I've got, I've never seen online play, and I categorically refuse to pay for anything that isn't provided with the thing. And I mean, even there was one, I had the Dance Evolution game, the iToy game, the Kinect game, sorry. And it had this thing of like, Kinect Online, and you can download the ability to play in expert mode. And it's like, come on guys, this is on the box. You've obviously finished the function, and you've disabled it to force people to go online so you can try and sell them stuff later. And it's like, I categorically refuse to do it. 3 terabyte patch, yeah. It's difficult. I understand, a modern game, this game, a good programmer could program on their own in 6 months, a game of this sort of standard, or even 3 if they're really good. Whereas a modern game, a single programmer probably can't create it, a AAA game, I mean. And the game prices haven't gone up. This game, Turtles cost my parents about £50 when we got it, and a modern game costs about 60, and by inflation terms it should be more like about 150 by now. So I get why the 3 terabyte patches are coming out on the first day. What I do get, but what I'm not happy to accept is the 0-day downloadable content. If you want to release extra content and charge for it, do it in 6 months' time, that's fine. If you want to charge a subscription fee for online play, well, you've got to keep the servers up, fine. But when you've got stuff that's on the box that doesn't work because you have to pay for it, or it's impossible to get because they've intentionally made it grindy, I've got no time for that, no time at all. And as I say, it's really all down to the fact that the iPhone has convinced everyone that games should be free to play, and also they are refusing to increase the prices to accurately represent inflation, because, as I say, this game, the games for the NES cost around £40-50. The games today cost about £40-50, and they should cost more like £100 or something. So they've intentionally convinced people the games aren't worth what they should be worth, and now they're trying to make up for it with sneaky stuff like this whole loot box nonsense, which, as I say, I find pretty deplorable. New retro consoles. Yep, completely agree. Yep, no, 100% agree. I collect the old consoles just for like the fun of it and things. But I mean, you know, if I woke up tomorrow and suddenly felt the need to play Mario 3, I wouldn't be getting this console out unless I would just be playing on an emulator. I mean, you know, I get that in the case of, you know, a pro gamer, which quite obviously from the fact I keep dying on the first world, you can tell I'm not. I quite get that a pro gamer will have to play on real hardware because there could be tiny discrepancies in the timing, and also if you're a developer and you want to release a commercial game, you need to test on real hardware, because I had some problems with the Chibi Akima's games on real hardware that emulators didn't show. But from the point of view of just a playing for fun player, emulators should be fine, and as you say, real hardware is going to always be a step above these retro remakes, but the retro remakes are really just emulators of a sort. I mean, the field programmable gate arrays and things, they aren't real hardware in the true sense of the word, and I know that's a controversial subject, but I say I got nothing against. I think a lot of people just want like the nostalgia of it, like, you know, I would guess there's probably Western people importing the Japanese Famicom, you know, this thing, just because they've never seen one before up close and things, which, yeah, I've no problem with that, but as you say, the Famicom clone in Japan in the second-hand store sells for around 6,000 yen, which is about £50. And the real Famicom, when they get one in the junk section, will sell for £3. So you could buy a Famicom, a real Famicom, a box full of games, cheap games like Mario 3. This copy was like 300 yen, so that's $3. So you could buy a real Famicom, Mario 1 and 3, and a bunch of other little tatty games for probably £20, and still have £40 or £30 to spare off the clone one. So it doesn't make sense yet. Now, in 50 years' time, when all of these don't work anymore, and people are needing a real retro fix, maybe it will start making sense. But right now, yeah, it bugs me a little bit. You know, I got in a bit of an argument on the MSX forums because I was saying, well, hang on a minute, this new MSX clone that's using a FGPA or whatever it is, it costs as much as like most of my MSXs put together, and it's not a real MSX in the literal sense of the word. It hasn't got a real Z80 in it or anything. It's like, I wouldn't mind if it was cheap. I wouldn't mind it if the old hardware had all broken and died out. But you can buy now an MSX2, or even an MSX2 Plus, for less than you can pre-order this thing that's not out yet for and may never come out. It's just like, what? It seems a bit backwards. But I say, if people want to buy that kind of thing, then go ahead. The Phoenix C256 and the X16. My understanding of them, and I've not looked too deeply into it, but my understanding of them is they are only using FGPA boards for chips for the parts of the hardware that really can't be made in any other way. So they've got a real processor, and they've got real memory chips, and they've got real logic in between where possible, and it's only the custom stuff that really they'd have to roll their own silicon for otherwise that they're using those chips for. So that seems to be the more sensible way. If the real hardware exists, use the real hardware, and if it doesn't exist, what are you doing? But the thing that really gets me is the Spectrum Next. The Spectrum Next has a port on the board so that you can plug a Raspberry Pi onto the main board and then use the Raspberry Pi as like a network card, and even an OpenGL chip they're claiming, I think, at one point. But it's like, well, your motherboard doesn't have, to my knowledge, a Z80 on it. It's all done with the FGGPA, and it's like, well, what exactly is the point of adding a processor many times faster than the processor of your emulated Z80 processor? You could just get the Raspberry Pi to do the entire job. It just seems totally backwards. Anyway, I say people. I mean, if people enjoy that kind of thing, and if that's what gets people to finally try programming, then go ahead. I just don't quite understand how the Spectrum Next can be considered a Spectrum when it has no Spectrum hardware really in it at all, and it's then got a Raspberry Pi built onto it that could actually emulate the entire Spectrum Next and have processing power to spare. But so if people, as long as it actually comes out, as long as it's not another ZX Vega, which I'm sure you all know about. Well, I mean, one that's quite interesting, these mini machines that are coming out, there's a PC Engine one that's coming out, and I suppose if that's released in the West, that could have some validity, because I never even heard of the PC Engine when I was a kid, or the TurboGrafx as it's called in the West. It was really never a thing. And yeah, they're not particularly expensive to buy in Japan. They're about 6,000 yen, a PC Engine itself, and then the game's 500 yen to about 5,000, just depending on the game. And then if you want that magical chase game, it's about $400 or something insane. But generally speaking, the games are still moderately affordable. But the point I'm making is, if you were in the West and you wanted wanted to have the PC Engine experience, so to speak, then I guess the simulated one. Was there ever a genre of game that never appeared on the CPC back in the day that you wished had appeared? Show jumping or firefighting? Well, I mean, I'm trying to think. I mean, I never played a good real-time strategy. I was a big fan of like Dune 2 on the on the PC. Sorry, Dune 2 on the PC was a game that really blew me and everyone else away, I think, at the time. Now I know there are real-time strategies on the CPC, but I don't think there's one that really could be said to give the same standard of experience as Dune did on the PC, and obviously within the limitations of the hardware. So that's one that I feel I would have liked to have seen a CPC Dune 2, I guess is what I'm saying. Now, beyond that, I mean, a lot of it was like limitations of the hardware. I mean, it never really had any first-person shooters that were amazing, but obviously that's nearly impossible on the hardware. I mean, it did have things like Hostages and Castle Master, which were brilliant to see and things, but as I say, that's something that was never there. I can't really think of anything that I ever missed out on. But I mean, even if there was something, I was only a basic programmer back in the day, but I was the kind my imagination would have taken over, and if I'd have spontaneously decided there needed to be a show jumping game on the CPC, then I'd have written my own in BASIC, so it would have never come up as a problem to me, because, as I say, where my technical ability was lacking, my imagination would have filled the gap, but it is interesting to see how games have changed over the years. I mean, like, there was a lot of hype with the thought of that Grand Theft Endo game, the GTA clone on the NES. Someone started working on a NES GTA game. Although, ironically, on the Amstrad, I saw, I think it was, I can't remember who said it. It might have been Funky Spectrum, or it might have been Zyphy, but someone said Postman Pat on the NES is the GTA of the CPC world, and you think it's not a comparison you expect to hear, but it is true, because the way the game mechanics work of driving around and doing errands and passing messages and things is basically the same concept, and it's got the same top-down design. It's just I don't think you run over as many gangsters in Postman Pat, but I might not be playing it right. Maybe you do. But even in a way, even GTA was a genre that was kind of covered on the CPC. But I mean, I don't know. I think in some ways, I think that's kind of a problem with games today. You're sort of saying about these genres being covered or not. In a lot of ways, like I said with Bubble Bobble, the things you wanted as a child on the game system were the things you saw around you. I wanted the game my friend had, or you'd want the game. I wanted Operation Wolf because I'd seen it in the arcade. Yeah, Pat Gritty, yeah. if you don't mind strong content, the Funky Spectrum Postman Pat video is hilarious. It's quite crude, but as I say, it's absolutely hilarious for the off-character Postman Pat he presents. But as I was saying though, the games that I would want would be the game I'd seen in the arcade, or the game my friend had, or the game of the film. You tend to end up driven in your imagination by the things you see around you, which wasn't too bad back in the 80s or the early 90s, because I wanted a game but I couldn't afford it, or I wanted a game but it never came out. I did actually start trying to write a Street Fighter game at one point, crazy point, because it never came out on the CPC. So you were in some ways, even if you were being entirely driven in the genres you wanted to see or the imagination you had, you were driven by the films you saw or the games you saw. Because if the game simply didn't come out or you couldn't afford it, you were limited there. But I do wonder whether that's, if I was 10 again today, I'd probably just spend the rest of my life just playing games on emulators, or just playing free-to-play games on mobile phones or something, or even demos on PC if they're still a thing. So it's the limitations, like I said before with the Mario design, it's the limitations that force the creativity. In my case, it was like, I don't have an image editing program, I'll write one. I did that just recently, but back in the day I did it as well. Or I want an animation program. I remember seeing I saw a TV series, and they were showing about how to control fireworks, real fireworks, with a computer. And you think, oh, that's amazing, fireworks and computers. So I wrote a little animation program that would do sprites of fireworks and do firework animations. And so again, it was like, well, obviously this isn't something you can do at home, or even certainly a child couldn't do. But you would take the inspiration you'd seen and then create the game of it. But I kind of suspect, if you wanted a firefighting game, you wouldn't even need any money to get it. Or if you wanted a show jumping game, I'm pretty sure all these things will exist on free-to-play phone games. Okay. Quite possibly. I mean, as I say, one of my friends had a Spectrum, and his brother was he was a good coder, he could code assembly. But, I mean, honestly, I went around and played the games on his machine occasionally, but I only played a handful of them. So never really got that much of a feeling for the Spectrum. My real experience with the Spectrum was I got this old computer from my dad when it was no longer any use to him, and it was really slow. And by the time I got it, it couldn't play any of the modern games that were really floating around it could a few, but mostly it couldn't. But I got my hands on this Spectrum emulator, and it could run them at about 60% speed, which was generally enough to play the games. And it came with this huge stack of Spectrum games. And that's where I came across really the Spectrum properly for the first time, because that was up until then it would be, hey, the friend would say, hey, let's play X or let's play Y, and it was always the big name game. So you never played more than one or two games when you went round to visit. But when I got this emulator, all of a sudden I had I can't remember how many games it came with, but it wasn't dozens, it was at least 100. And it was a wide range of different styles of games. That's interesting. I managed to send that turtle flying in midair there. So it was then that I really started to play the Back to School. That was the first time I played that, and the Bugsy game, the spoof gangster game, and the Mugsy game as well, Millionaire, not Megalomania, what's it called? Armageddon Man. So I played lots and lots of weird and wonderful games on the Spectrum then, and really started to have more of an appreciation for the variety it had, even though, I mean, in almost all cases the Amstrad beat it technically. There were a few cases because of the screen memory. The screen memory on the Spectrum was so simple that it was faster, and there were some times where that just killed the CPC, and the Amstrad and the Speccy was laughing at it. The worst example of that, I think, is Midnight Resistance. Midnight Resistance on the C64 is a classic. On the Speccy, it's pretty good. on the Amstrad, it's an embarrassment. It's really, really bad. So that's one where the Amstrad fans just have to keep quiet and just be laughed at. And then we get our revenge later on with the more colourful games like Rainbow Islands, which actually has all the colours of the rainbow on the CPC and is black and white on the Speccy and is a 4-colour mush on the C64. But as I say, there were some we certainly lost out on. But the Speccy, as you say, I mean, with all of these systems, like I've just said with the Mario, it's not about what it can and can't do. Certainly not today. It's about what you make it, how creative you can be, and how you can work within the limitations of the hardware, and make something that really shows off your ability. I suppose is the truth. You're not showing off the ability of the hardware anymore. The Vespertino thing or the Batman Group's pinball game, I mean, the community see it as, look how great the Amstrad is, but it's not really that. It's look how great the Batman Group are. Exile, nope, never played that. I'm going to have to go over the chat history, aren't I, at the end of this and give all the games a quick go. But again, this is the trouble. There's so many of these great games that even 8-bit games, games like Elite, yes, Prime Minister's another one that you could just play these games for days, not just hours. And as I say, the Armageddon Man was another one that I've had a quick go now, but it's like I remember playing this for so long, and it was exciting. I mean, I'll just explain the game for you. Armageddon Man is this strategy game. It's a bit like the Millionaire type or the Rockstar Ate My Hamster, where you're given a bunch of options and you choose the options and the gameplay changes. But in Armageddon Man, you're this person in this you're in like a space satellite or something outside of the Earth, and you're viewing the entire Earth, and the decisions you're making, you are controlling the entire Earth. So you're kind of like you're like this sort of computer in war games or something. You're controlling the entire political and military might of the entire world, and you're manipulating the entire world population through your decisions. And as I say, there's something about that. Even though it's very graphically simple, you've just got a crude map with a bunch of missiles on it, and you've got an inbox, and it will give you text messages. But there's something about that I found at the time, when I played it on an emulator, really exciting and really invigorating and really enthralling. But again, it's just like these days, spending an entire weekend playing that again, it wouldn't necessarily feel like the best use of my time. But it was a game that I do remember was one that really, for me, you could write that in BASIC. There was no graphical requirements of that game as such. It was just a simulation from a mathematical point of view of a world with political problems and with the potential for nuclear war was the plot in that one. But as I say, a very fun and a very interesting in-depth game. But yeah, another one that I did have a play on it on the DS on the Speccy emulator, but or was it the CPC? But as I was kind of poking it, and I'm like, I can't remember how this works anymore. Right. Yeah. Well, I mean again, I think that's again something that, is it getting lost? I don't know. I got very enthralled with Frontier on the PC at one point. I think I played it for an entire week or something silly, and Total Recall as well. It was like it sounds ridiculous, but you almost started to feel like you were there, because with Total Recall you had all of these like limitations like water and time of day and things, and it really started to make it feel more enveloping as a sort of a virtual world, which considering the comically limited graphics and frame rate seems impossible, and I'm sure it wouldn't work on anyone today. But say back then it really did have that feel. But yeah, as you say, it is quite interesting just how little, graphically speaking, you can have and still capture an audience and keep their fascination for long periods of time. And I think maybe that's, again, I do feel that, ironically, I'm teaching assembly in my tutorials, but I really think that someone who only knew BASIC could very easily create a simulation game, like the Millionaire game, or like the Armageddon Man, or a Risk type game, a turn-based strategy. There's no reason you couldn't create that in BASIC, and there's no reason it couldn't be an addictive game that people could really, enjoy. So, I think a lot of the time it's people's confidence and enthusiasm that holds them back from making new games, and not really their technical ability, because you have to have, well, especially with, as I say, things like the Retro Virtual Machine, these C++ wrappers, and even these basic sprite routines and things. You can do a lot, technically speaking, with very little, even on an old 8-bit machine. So the fact that people aren't churning out lots of little simple but fun and fascinating games is a bit frustrating, and I do think it's people become scared to try, because the community are quite understandably always obsessed with the Pinball Dreams and the Vespertino, but they don't. I worry that they don't appreciate that the man with the floating head. Yeah, well, I mean, I think if in the early 90s or the very late 80s, a commercial game was released in BASIC, I think that would be a bit cheeky, from the point of view of value for money. But if an amateur today wrote a game in BASIC and it was playable, and someone got some enjoyment out of it, I think that's a worthwhile achievement. And as I say, I do worry that the obsession, while understandable with the very, very impressive games being released now with the CPC Plus features, with the heavy CRTC tricks bending the limits of the Amstrad CPC to the absolute breaking point, you're excluding the vast majority of the community from being able to compete. I would never be able to write that Vespertino game, and there's no chance of me ever writing that, because even if I don't have the technical ability, and even if I did, I think I'd go insane first from the debugging, So if that's the minimum standard, if that became the minimum standard of games that the CPC community came to expect, they would be writing off most of the developers who were able to program games, and even worse, they would be discouraging the beginners from having their first go. That's my concern. I did that. There's a little programming competition on my website at the moment, just to win like a T-shirt. And the rule was you have to show off a game, but the winner will be selected at random. And the reason was I want to make sure I don't want to get people who don't care about programming or don't care about games even just submit winning T-shirts, because I can't give away infinite free T-shirts. But I want people to have a go. I don't want to reward the best programmer, because the best programmer is always going to be some very, very skilled person who's been doing it a long time. And really what we need to do is encourage everyone to have a go, because, as I say, it should be about personal achievement, not about writing the next Vespertino, because none of us are pretty much none of us are going to write the next Vespertino. Only one or two people in the world, in the CPC community, who have the skill level and the experience to write a game of that standard. So the rest of us have to achieve something at a lower standard. And as I say, if the community get this attitude of, well, if your game is not as good as Vespertino, or doesn't have at least 20 frames a second or whatever, there's going to be very few programmers left in the CPC community and in the 8-bit community in general. So hopefully things won't get like that. No, there's no pressure, James. I have no point. The idea of doing the T-shirt was mostly to get people to give the forum a go, and also just to give a little bit of an incentive to people to give programming a go, because, as I say, I just want. I don't want there to be people out there who think think, oh, I wish I could write a game like that, but I'm not smart enough. Because I've thought that before now, and it's very unlikely to be true, because, as I say, I'm pretty certain anyone can write a game that will be a bit of fun in BASIC. I think anyone could do that who is, has any mathematical ability. So I always try and encourage people to give it a go, and I always try and point out, I got an E in mathematics at A level, and if I can write games that are playable, then I'm pretty sure you can write something playable as well. Just because, as I say, I know what it's like. People convince themselves that they're not smart enough because they think that the people writing the professional-looking games somehow did them by magic in a few minutes, and they didn't. They worked, well, some of them might have, but the vast majority didn't. The vast majority of them have worked at those games for hundreds of hours, I would suspect. First Chibi Akumas took about 600 hours. The remake, the version 1.666, I actually timed that when I ran clocks on it for my patrons, and that was another 600 split. Mostly, I think the MSX version took most of the time. The Enterprise version took virtually no time. The Speccy version took about 100 hours. So, as I say, if a game like that doesn't come out of skill, it doesn't come out of knowledge, it doesn't come out of mathematical ability, certainly not because I haven't got it. It came out of just dedicated work, perseverance, and confidence. And I didn't have any confidence I could write the first game. I was just doing it on the basis of, well, I've got nothing better to do, is the truth of it. It was just like, well, I can't see myself. It was just like, well, I don't think I can probably manage anything, but I'll see how far I can take it. And in the end, the game work came out. But as I say, it's just trying to make people aware that I can't do this isn't the answer. I don't have time to do this. I don't see the point. Those are fine answers. Those are reasons not to do something. Lack of self-confidence is the wrong reason. It's an understandable reason, but it's the wrong reason to give up on something. And I think sometimes there is too much elitism, and there is too much praise for the very skilled people and not enough praise for the beginners, because the very skilled people at some point were beginners, even if it was when they were very young. So we all need to just encourage it. Miyamoto, well, I can only I've heard the name, but I can't remember who he is. Is he the Mario creator? Yes, being as I don't know who he is really, yes, I'd certainly say he's overrated. But I'd say my comments on Mario, the point I was really trying to make is the fact that limitations become, working within the limitations becomes the inspiration for creation. And I forgot to say at the time, my Chibi Akuma's character, the Chibico character that you see in the corner of the screen here, was designed in the same mentality of, well, I need a character with a big head that's visible, I need a character with visible hands, so I've got the straps on the arms, and the outfit was just, well, what works within a very simple size and things. So yes, I think any time you get to the point of cult behaviour, it's gone beyond what is reasonable, isn't it? I think with most people and things, you get to the point where there's a point where it's justified, and then there's a point where things have probably gone beyond what they should. The Steve Jobs thing was just blooming ridiculous, it's not. From the irony is, you get all of these sort of people who act like he's like Jesus or something, the Jesus of computing. And from what I hear, and I've heard it regularly, and I've not heard anyone dispel it, he would not pass modern human resources requirements, shall we say, because he was not a particularly nice person to his employees in some cases. So the kind of people I think who are obsessed with Apple and obsessed with Steve Jobs, certainly in the early days, I think would would be unable to ethically balance that obsession with the way I've heard he treated some employees, because they're the same kind of people who would be the first to jump to HR. I've heard that, yeah. I've heard was Wizard of Woz, wasn't it? They were calling him. I never knew Apple back then, so I've kind of caught it all retrospectively. Yeah, Joe. That's. I've heard things. I've heard of things that Jobs did that I would be personally extremely. That he said to people that I would find personally offensive. So I'm perfectly willing to forgive people their mistakes. I'm perfectly willing to accept that everyone has flaws, and that people who are very hard bosses can be very effective bosses, and no problem with any of those things. But let's not pretend that he's Jesus, because if you've got good parts and bad parts, you've got to accept both. So Jobs might have been a great designer, and he might have been a great personality for the company. As you say, though, from what I hear, that it was Steve who was the one who brought the technical prowess to it. So, you've got to have a lot of respect, though, for what Apple achieved. I'm not trying to take that away from them. I mean, I remember, I think it was The Register, the tech site, The Register. I remembered reading the reviews for the first iPhone, and they just said, "Oh, this is going to fail. This is going to fail so hard. This is ridiculous." And I thought the same thing, because we'd all seen the Palm computers, and I already had a Pocket PC long before that. It wasn't a new idea as such. It was a handheld computer. It had a phone attached to it, but this wasn't nothing. There was nothing new here, and you just thought, well, this is silly. This has been done before. It ain't going to work. But the business model of the store that allowed people to write their own games and get a cut of the money, that just sort of exploded. And the fact that it was outside of the price range of the average user, but that they could, lower the price by doing ridiculous monthly subscriptions, gave it a Rolex style feel to it, which I say made people. I mean, I don't know if you heard that sad story. I think it was a Chinese guy. He sold one of his kidneys to buy an iPhone, and the doctors botched the job, and his other kidney got infected, and now he's on dialysis or worse. And that was the kind of thing that was going on. Just people were acting like the iPhone was, like gonna. It was like they seemed to act like it was some golden ticket to some like elitist class or something, and it was like, well, this isn't what you should be spending your money on. And I think, fortunately, in a lot of ways, now that the old iPhones are, you got kids with old iPhones because their parents have upgraded, so it's no longer got that kind of, as I say, designer feel to it. Yeah, I agree on your comments on the walled garden. It's difficult, though. You get people who say, oh, well, I can't understand why people would buy an iPhone. The Android can do everything it can. And I had this problem firsthand when I came to Japan. I came to Japan, and you kept asking people questions like, I keep getting lost on the streets and I can't find my way. And I asked, can you get like a GPS thing to find the way on the streets? And people would look at you like, what's that? And you'd ask people questions about how to do things, and they'd always say, well, I just use my iPhone for that. I just do the iPhone for this. If you had an iPhone for that, you'd be fine. And so I gave in and I got the iPhone. And I mean, what finished it off for me is I wanted to transfer an image to the iPhone, and I was trying to do it via, I was trying to email it myself, and my email account's got this encryption on it, and it kept encrypting it to myself, and then the iPhone couldn't view it. And then I tried to transfer it via iTunes, and it wouldn't work because iTunes is daft. And it really is just like, well, if I had an Android, I could just do this with an SD card. And so I migrated to an Android the next time, and my company needed a spare iPhone to use as a tablet device, basically. So my iPhone was still perfectly good, but it was out of contract, and I could now upgrade for free. So I went to the store and said, right, well, I've got this old iPhone which I want to keep. Pretend to be a moral company. Well, yeah, I mean, I think all of the companies have that problem, and as I say, it was just like the way that Steve Jobs was acting and the way the company acts. I mean, there was that recent thing. It's Tim Cook, is it now, the head of Apple? He was sort of saying before about like social justice. You know, it's the company's job to promote good social values for the community, and then recently they've just removed that application for the for the Hong Kong thing, and it's just like, oh yeah, okay, so so you're only interested in doing that for the US, you know, you're not interested when it comes to the China side. Then, so I'd say there is a bit of I understand it, but there's a bit of hypocrisy there sometimes, it feels. But anyway, I moved to this Android. And so I went into the store and I sort of said, okay, I want to keep my old phone, but I want to move to the cheapest Android you've got, basically. And it very nearly turned out more expensive to move to the cheapest Android from the iPhone, because they've basically got the pricing structure set up in such a way that the iPhone is cheaper than everything else, or at least the same price. And it was tricky because it was things like, oh, well, if you buy the iPhone, you only get a 2 meg. I think it was 2 megabytes, but it might have been 2 gigabytes, sorry. You get this 2 gig limit per month, and if you buy the Android, you get 5 gig limit. And so because of that, the Android monthly fee is higher, and because of that, the fact that you pay more per month for the iPhone is actually not visible, and the price is now the same for the cheap nasty Android as it is for the expensive iPhone. So, but it really infuriated me, because it's like, hang on a minute, guys, I'm in Japan here, I'm trying to buy a Japanese Android, and you're making the American iPhone cheaper. You're selling out your own economy to an American company here. And it's just like, what are you doing? I mean, okay, it's like, look, it might be good today, but you know, Sony have given up on their Android business, and it's not surprising why, because half the population are using a single brand of mobile phone. So yeah, it does. I say I can't. I mean, I'm no way denying the iPhone is a good product, and I have a lot of respect for their ability to market the product and their ability to create the walled garden. But on a personal level, you know, I mean, I wrote an iPhone game many years ago when I was short of money, and I thought maybe I could make a few extra quid on the side, and actually it ended up costing me money because I had to buy it wasn't an iPhone, I couldn't afford the iPhone. I bought the iPod Touch, which was basically an iPhone 2 at the time, I think, iPhone 3 maybe, and I wrote this little game for it, and I paid the money to sell the game online, and I paid $50 a year to compile the game, and then I made $16 in total ever. So I actually lost about $200 making my game, which was a bit of a bummer, but that's the way it goes. But I can't even play my own game now because I can't compile the game anymore, because it's all walled garden, isn't it? You know, I can't run the game on a modern iPhone if I had one, because they've changed it to 64-bit and because they've removed all the backwards compatibility, and I can't compile it myself even for my own phone because you need the developer license to do that. And again, it's just like, well, yeah, I kind of have the opinion that maybe hobbyist development should be free, and you shouldn't be being restricted by how much money you have. And okay, I know $50 a year isn't a lot of money, but if you're an amateur developer, or if you're a kid trying to develop for fun for your own iPhone, I kind of think that should be free. Not real games. I certainly know what you're saying. I think part of the problem is that the mobile phones tend to only work with touch controls, and while my hand's actually cramping up now, I've been playing for so long, and while touch controls have a lot of creative potential for certain types of games that joypad controls don't have, they're also utterly useless for other types of games. I mean, you know, I wouldn't fancy trying to play Mario on a touch screen. I think there's emulators that try and do that, but I certainly wouldn't try and fancy it. Now, you tended to descend to those kind of Mario. They had that Mario Run game or something where you were literally just controlling the jump button or something, which again is an interesting idea. And as I say, I'm totally in favour of people working within limitations and creating new ideas. But I think the problem with the iPhone store now is, because everyone's been trying to make money on it for what, 10, 15 years, I kind of wonder if all the ideas haven't already been mostly exhausted by that now. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, you never know what's going to come up in the future, but I kind of suspect that most of the new revolutionary ideas that can be done with a touchscreen have probably been done by now. But as I say, incidentally, I don't know if you remember this, but if any of you are CPC fans, there was an old game called Space Hockey that came on a CPC an Amstrad Action Type-In, and that was the name of the game. I remade it as an iPhone game, a touch game, and the source code I did put online. It's on my BenkyoStudio.com website, so if you've got the old Xcode, you can compile it, and it does still. I did actually play it again on the old version of Xcode, which they've taken offline and you have to find, and it doesn't compile on the new version and what have you. So, actually, that might not be true. I compiled it on an old Mac and the new version wouldn't install, so I couldn't confirm whether it worked on the new version or not. But as I say, if you remember the Space Hockey game on the Amstrad CPC Type-In and spontaneously feel like a touchpad version on the iPhone, getting cramps in my hand here, and then yeah, that's something you probably want to try. Modern programmers are spoiled. I don't know what modern programmers have. Possibly. I mean, everyone's using Unity now, or the Unreal Engine. I mean, I think the fascinating thing is that sorry, I'm getting really bad hand cramps here. I'm going to pause the game. I'm not going to be able to play anymore today because my hand's starting to ache and I don't want to be paralysed from playing badly at Mario. Let's put the Killer one on when it's done instead. I mean, everyone's using Unity and Unreal, and on one hand I'm very much in favour of that because my understanding is that both are free for amateur development, and even I think they're free for, I think Unreal at least is free if you're developing and you only make a small amount of money, and a small amount of money is quite a lot of money. So I'm all in favour of that from the point of view of, if you've got kids who are able to write their own professional style games because they've got a professional style engine. I'm totally in favour of that, but again, it's always just a question of to what extent are you actually doing creative or educational things, and to what extent are you just drag-dropping things into a window? Because as I say, if you're just using a pre-compiled set of assets for a game, and then you're writing the game logic, and the game logic is heavily formula-based, then that's brilliant. You're learning algebra, you're learning program structures, you're learning, to work out, the logic of the game. And equally the other way around, if you're just using an off-the-shelf first-person shooter engine and you're selecting your boss character and your bullets for the boss or something, and the rest is all being pre-programmed for you. If you're drawing the graphics in Blender, well, you're learning to use a graphics package, or even if it's 2D and you're drawing them in Kaito or Photoshop, you're learning artistic skills there. So that's all good. It's just, I saw this one. I think, where did I see it? I saw this one, and they've got some like drag-drop programming engine. It was the Codemasters. I think one of the Oliver twins had like written this really complex game in Pac-Man or some really complex game in this like drag and drop game engine. But the game engine itself seemed very flowcharty, really, really literally drag and drop. And it's like, well, I can't help feeling that's just a little bit too simple. Something like the Java-based development package for the Arduinos. That's proper programming. That's really legitimate programming. And the Raspberry Pi has got C assemblers and things, and again, that's proper programming. And BASIC, even though everyone slurs it, I understand why people slur it, but you're learning some serious stuff there. But I'm not sure that just drag-dropping things to create structures is quite... I mean, you're learning structures, but it doesn't quite feel enough to me. So that kind of side of things do feel just a bit too simplistic. But as I say, again, Unity is it's just something I don't have time for. You know, it's not. I don't mean that in a disparaging way. You know, if one day I decided to stop programming assembly and move on to something else, then maybe I'd start learning that. But again, it's like, well, punch card programming. Well, I mean, yeah, it's funny you mention that. I mean, I don't know if you know, but I'm planning to cover the PDP-11 next year, which is this old, I think it was classed as a mini computer. The CPU unit is, you know, it's kind of the size of an old PC. And the thing with that is it has a bunch of switches on the front, and you can step through the memory with the switches, and you can poke individual bytes of memory in with the switches, and it would commonly be connected via an external punch card reader to load in programs. And so what I think you ended up having to do is program in the first few bytes of the bootstrap with the switches, and then bootstrap up from your punch card reader or later your magnetic tape or your hard disk. There's a Java emulation of it. It's quite fun. I only extended up to making an ink command in a loop, and then I watched the memory address that it was inking, and watched the lights change as the bytes in that memory address changed. But there was something quite satisfying of that. And there's even a Raspberry Pi recreation of the full front board with all the LEDs and all the physical switches, but it probably costs a fortune. And like I say, what you'd do with it above what you would do the Java version, I don't know. But as I say, it's certainly impressive to see. And again, it's I don't know. I read a review of the Raspberry Pi one, and someone said, "Oh, it's like the essential thing for all computer users or for all programmers or something." And it's like, no. I think it's fascinating I think it's worthwhile bearing in mind where computing has come from and understanding some of the difficulties of the past, and to appreciate where we are today, and to, in some cases, understand some of the things like assembly. It's worth knowing a little bit about how processors work, just so you can kind of have some framing for where things are today. But to claim that every person who's into computers should own this thing with these mechanical switches and these LEDs that probably cost about £400 or something is just like, it's totally beyond what is realistic. I think people should probably, if people are into computer programming, should probably understand that this was what the early mainframes were, maybe early computers were like, mini computers or the desktop computers, because the Altair, that Z80 thing, that looked very similar as well. And I didn't realise that until I'd never even heard of the thing until I read some old history of the Z80 and the history of 6502 computer books that were written in Japanese, actually. And I didn't know about that system because it was just before my time. As I say, Z80 was really the first thing I came across. But so it's certainly interesting to understand where things were, and with the PDP-11, that's from what I understand. I will have to take it as true because I've heard it claimed. That one was a big influence on all of the later processors that came afterwards. Okay. I didn't know that, but it's definitely, I knew it was true of a word. One thing that confuses me with I think it's the ARM or some of the other systems. I think it's the ARM. They refer to the word as 32-bit, and it's like, I'd really prefer you not to do that. I don't want to get confused. I've got a fairly fixed understanding of what a word is. Don't start changing the name on me. But yeah, I didn't know that, but it's certainly interesting. The other thing with PDP is it was really ironic. I was writing. There's a nice ASCII table on my website that I made a few months ago, and I was thinking like, well, let's not just put ASCII in here. Let's put hex in there, because often you need to convert hex to decimal, or ASCII to hex, or ASCII to decimal. So let's put all three line by line, and let's put binary in there as well, because binary. Sometimes people struggle with converting binary, and even I do. And it's nice to see the three together, because you start to get an understanding of how they work together just from seeing them next to each other so often. So I thought, let's put that in there as well. And then I thought, well, I don't suppose there's any point putting octal in, because the only time in my entire life I've ever used octal is for setting the attributes of files in Linux. And, it's like, well, it's usually just set it to 777. That's all I ever know about it. So I thought, well, I don't think there's any point putting octal in. And then I thought, well, no, there's space. There's space in there. So let's put it in. But I guess there's no real point to it. I'll put it in anyway, just for the sake of it. So I'll put it in. And then, I think less than a month later, I think it was 2 weeks later, I looked at PDP. And it's like, oh, PDP likes octal. The switchboard on the front is in octal. And the command list, the bytecode for the command list is in octal. And then I tried the Russian computer, the UKNC or something like that, I forget the name of it. And it's got a debugger, and you debug the code. And it's like, oh my God, everything's in octal. The addresses are in octal, the bytecode's in octal. There's no hex option. It's not just like, oh, octal's the default. Everything on PDP processors is from start to finish octal. Every command is in octal. Every command that you run on the emulators or on the hardware itself, the debuggers are in octal, the memory dumps are in octal. It's octal all the way down, and you're just like, in 2 weeks it's gone from a thing I've never really used in my entire life to, if I'm going to program this system, I have no choice but to use it. And that really... that was really quite shocking to me, because, as I say, this is after I've programmed 25 different assemblers, and it's just like, this one processor just introduces you to a whole different way of programming and a different way of looking at numbers, really, is the truth of it. And I'm not saying there's any point to octal now, but as I say, it was just really quite shocking to me. And the PDP-11 is, I would say, pretty certainly influenced the 68000 processor. And I've heard it said it certainly influenced the 6809, because the developer of the 6809 said that he wanted to create a processor like the PDP. And I've heard it said that the PDP influenced 8086, which I can't really... Well, I'm not saying it's not true. It just seems that the 8080... I mean, in some ways, you'd say if 8086 was influenced by PDP, it would have been better, because 8086 was like, it feels quite kludgy in places, and I sort of show it's the 8080 in the fact that it's essentially it's kind of like it's got a 16-bit address bus that kind of has been kludged to be more. But as I say, I'm not denying what they're saying, but that's more surprising to me. 68,000 and PDP seem very similar. But anyway, when I realised just how much there was to learn from PDP in the sense of octal and in the sense of how advanced it was for its day, that was what convinced me to look at the TI 99, the TMS 9900 processor, or whatever it's called, because that's what had mentioned to me. People had suggested, oh, take a look at this, it's really interesting. And I'd thought at the time, well, I'm sorry, but I've looked at the processor. It only had one real pro computer that ever used it. I can't spend time on a one machine processor. It's just too much work for too few YouTube views in the result of it. But after seeing the PDP-11 and realizing just how different it was in the sense of the octal and things, I thought, I'm not really sure I'm not really sure it's smart for me to not look at the TMS 9900, because I don't know if you don't know this, but the TMS has no stack. It doesn't use a stack. And it also doesn't really have registers. And that was the other thing. The PDP-11, the way it does calls and returns, is more like the ARM processor than all the other processors I've looked at. You use one of the registers as a return, and then you push that register onto the stack if you want to nest. From my memory, no, that's not actually quite true. It's even weirder than that. But basically, as I say, I was seeing things in PDP that I was like, well, the last time I saw this is in the ARM. I've not seen this in x86. I've not seen this in 6502, Z80, 68000. This way of calling really reminds me of the ARM, which is a modern processor. So that quite shocked me. And as I say, I decided to look at this TMS 9900, which, as I say, it's got no stack, and it uses a chunk of memory as I think it's 16 registers, it uses 16, kind of like a 0 page, and whenever you start a new subroutine, you can start a new bank of 16 registers for your subroutine, and then when you return, you restore the old registers. So again, it was like, well, this is just I'm not really interested in the hardware this works on. The TI 99. I'm not interested in the TI 99. I'm not really. I can't really think of a use of knowing this assembly language. But the fact that it's so different to all the other assembly languages I know, maybe there's things to learn from it in programming others. Maybe there's tricks that I will learn. Maybe there's a new way of looking at, storing memory and dealing with switching between subroutines and handling your registers. Maybe there's something that I will learn from that really hasn't occurred to me before, and in all of the other systems I've learned. And maybe if I look at this system, maybe it will make my ARM tutorials better, because I will have new ideas of ways of dealing with registers when you've not got a stack to deal with things, or your stack doesn't know it. Yeah, yeah. The IBM PC. I mean, there's always the legendary. It's the PC Junior, isn't it? They realised they'd opened too much out, and everyone was copying them, so they tried to create the closed PC Junior, and it failed. That's always a funny story, but it's interesting. I'm planning on doing this stream on. Yeah, Amiga. I'm planning on doing the stream of the game The Seventh Guest for Halloween. It'll be the weekend after Halloween, and that's a game that, well, I don't want to spoil the stream, but that's a game that really was pushing the PC to the utter limits at the time, and it used AdLib or even General MIDI, and it used Super VGA. But the PCs I came across were the CGA x86, although it was only black and white, and it was the PC 1512, the Amstrad version, which was slightly hybrid. It had some weird things about it. But then I had a 16 megahertz 386, which was VGA, and then my dad had a slightly faster one, which had Super VGA, so that could do 640 by 480 at or maybe 400 at 256 color. But I never had an EGA machine, for example, but I did play a few EGA games because you could get them cheap and things. So, but yeah, the Amiga, absolutely Amiga blew the PC out of the water for a long time. But it's interesting because I think the Amiga, they didn't. The hard drives weren't mainstream enough, because by the end, they were still managing. I think Mortal Kombat came out on the Amiga, even though on the PC I think it was about 5 discs. In the Amiga, they somehow managed to get it on 3 discs, even though the Amiga discs were half the size. But I mean, as you say, the Amiga, I mean, it was capable of hardware scrolling. It was capable of 2 parallax layers and hardware sprites, even though the hardware sprites were a bit tricky. And the VGA machines, they were all software all the way, weren't they? So the Amiga quite rightly beat the PC on graphics, and sound was just like crazy. Amiga was legendary for its sound, so it wasn't surprising that the Amiga was wiping out the PC. But the PC, it's like in my family, the PC snuck in on under the guise of a business machine, and then when business ended, people wanted to do something else with it, and so they were playing games on it. I mean, the first PC game, I think the PC took over with the VGA 386s. Like Cannon Fodder on the PC was a really... I don't think the Amiga game version had anything over the PC version. Street Fighter 2 might have been better on the Amiga, I'm not entirely sure, but as I say, by those kind of days, and then when Wolfenstein 3D came out, I could just about play it on my old 386, but it was just like, then the Amiga just lost to the superior processing power, because although the Amiga, some of them were very fast, I believe most people, when they were looking at the Amiga, were looking at the Amiga 500, which by then it hadn't got the hard drive space, it hadn't got the processing power anymore. So, but yes, as you say, the early PCs were very limited. I mean, really in a lot of cases, the CPC was beating them. Okay, yeah. As I say, I've certainly heard people criticise the DOS games, but I say I'm really thinking of the really early CGA EGA ones, which, as I say, though, in most cases the Amstrad CPC would beat it. But when I came to the XT, I had a copy of Quick Basic, not QBasic, Quick Basic, the more advanced version, because my dad had used it for programming, so we had the programming tools. And the Amstrad CPC, I'd always been a basic programmer, and I had some routines that you got from the cover tapes and things that would do hardware sprites, the software sprites, sorry, but in assembly, and also sound, music, and I had one that did like double height graphics, but they would always they'd always crash if you tried to load two in at the same time, and for that reason it was kind of you were always really just stuck with very simple graphics and very simple sound and things on the CPC. But then I moved to Quick Basic, which had built-in sprite functionality, and even on the old 1512, which I guess it probably had a 4 MHz processor, and I don't think it was technically 16-bit. I think it was an 8-bit processor, but it was so fast. It was so fast compared to the CPC, and even though the graphics were arguably inferior, and especially the machine we had was black and white, it was just, you were just like, I can do so much stuff on this that I could never dream of doing on the CPC, and the floppy disks were cheap, and so I am looking at doing EGA and VGA tutorials next year. I'm not sure what really killed the Amiga finally. I'm not particularly aware it's the graphics. I'm not saying you're wrong. I mean, I think by the time the 486 came out, I think most of the PC game players were just upgrading heavily and regularly, where I think the Amiga people I knew, a lot of them just had Amiga 500s and things, which were the base processor that wasn't very fast. And I think maybe that was the problem. When like Doom came out, all of the people were using the latest PC, and when a game like Theme Park came out, most of the people were still using an Amiga 500, I suspect, would be my guess. But as I say, I never owned an Amiga back in the day. We moved to the PCs, and it was just like, well, you couldn't really justify the Amiga when the PCs were, when we had the PCs around, and by the time the Amiga was cheap enough, it was kind of like, well, the PC had already taken over really, and it was no longer a thing anyone was looking at. But I mean, the Amiga is. I do feel that it's a shame the 68,000 processor didn't do better. When you look at the original 8086 and things, and you look at the 68,000, it's like 68,000 is such a nice processor compared to the 8086. It's like, it's like you always see in the films, the good guy wins and the underdog wins, and in this case, it was like the wrong person won. The X80, we should be all using 68,000 base processors today. If the better person had won, we'd be all using 68,000 base processors today rather than 8086s. I think they've cleaned up a lot of the mess with regards to the change to protected mode and x64 and things. I think all of the ridiculous heritage has mostly gone now. But as I say, when you look at the 68,000 with its full 32-bit registers, and its its large selection of registers, and its true 24-bit addressing, and actually the address registers are all 32-bit, even though the addressing originally wasn't. And then you look at the 8086 and the nasty registers on that, and the banking, and you just think, and the COM files that can only access 64K of RAM in total, and you're just like, oh god. And it uses it's still 40 pin. It uses the address pins it uses the data pins to achieve the full address bus. So it's not even got the same number of pins. The 68,000 had all of the pins. It got data pins and you'd got address pins. But anyway, I guess they must have. Yeah. Well, I say I'm not trying to claim the 68,000 is better than the modern x86. Of course, I'm not trying to claim that. I'm just saying that you kind of feel that the 68,000 should have won. Kind of like I guess it's kind of like your Android versus your iPhone again. You know, the marketing or maybe the cost won on the x86 side, and the 68,000. I don't know if it was cost or if it was poor marketing or poor business liaisons, but for whatever reason, the 68,000 it gave a good fight. You know, the later x68s, they had really fast processors, but for whatever reason, it died out and the PCs took over. So slightly a shame, but anyway, as I say, that's where it got to. So anyway, I'm going to call it a night now. It's 9:30 here, so it's not that I'm too tired, but it's just my voice is actually going. I don't know if you can tell, it's starting to get a bit sore because I don't usually gibber away on like this for 3.5 hours. But Betamax, that's an interesting one. I've heard Betamax is better, but I've never. I saw a Betamax tape player in the store today, just last week in the second-hand shop, and it didn't work. But I've never seen a Betamax tape. You don't see them ever. You don't really see VHS anymore. But I've got a Laserdisc player. I've got a collection of Laserdiscs. Laserdisc's quite fun, but Betamax not something you see. Anyway, so we'll be doing this again at some point. Certainly, we will be doing. Yeah, there's loads of weird video. The Angry Video Game Nerd, James Rolfe, he did this huge video on all these kind of crazy technologies I'd never even heard of, magnetic optical discs and things. But anyway, I'll be doing a live stream on Halloween of The Seventh Guest, and I'll be chatting, and I'm actually rereading all the books on that because I've got the novelization and there's some documentation online of technically and things. So I'll be doing this big stream on The Seventh Guest. So please catch the Halloween one. I'm toying with doing an early morning stream, which is on Monday because it's a national holiday on Monday. So that would be about 9 p.m. UK time in the evening on Sunday, I think, if I'm getting that right. So if I do that, just check the channel or check my Patreon. I'll make a public Patreon post, or check my forum. There's a sticky for upcoming live streams. So I'm planning to do that, and I'll put that up tonight maybe. But I will be doing these kind of gaming ones again in the future. I'm not sure if it'll be every 2 weeks or what, but well, as I say, James, don't worry too much. If you want the T-shirt, you got to enter this time. But if you've got something ready and it's not ready yet, don't worry, because I'm going to do some kind of competition again next year. I might be giving away some of my spare hardware, like a Game Boy or something small that I can ship. Or if not, I'll be doing T-shirts again, because as long as the only reason I won't do it is if I start getting like proper freeloaders who are scamming it, just ripping Hello World off from someone else's website and uploading them and claiming it's all their own work. As long as I'm getting legitimate posts, I will do the competitions again, because, as I say, it's a bit of fun for me. I get to give away a bit of merchandise and whatever. So anyway, really appreciate everyone who's been watching. I'm showing 7 views, but one of those is me. But if 6 people are willing to listen to me ramble on, that's incredible. So really appreciate it. And thanks for watching, everyone. Let me put the thanks for watching clip on. Thanks for watching, and goodbye. Take care now.